28 years is long enough to convince yourself you survived, long enough to build a life around the fact that you made it out when thousands didn't, long enough to tell yourself that the thing living in your blood is dormant, controlled, beaten into submission by antibodies that have spent nearly 3 decades keeping infection at bay, long enough to believe that Raccoon City really did end on that October night in 1998, when a thermobaric missile turned a thriving American city into a crater in the Midwestern countryside. But the thing about biological contamination is that it doesn't actually care about your timeline. It doesn't respect the narrative you've built about being a survivor. Viruses operate on their own schedule, adapting, mutating, finding ways around the defenses your body erected against them. And sometimes, after 28 years of dormancy, they wake up, not because of some dramatic trigger or external catalyst, but simply because they've finally figured out how to overcome the thing that was keeping them locked away. This is the horror at the center of Resident Evil Requiem. The game isn't about a new outbreak or a fresh catastrophe. It's about discovering that the outbreak never actually stopped, that survival was always temporary, and that the real nightmare begins when you realize your body has been a battlefield this entire time and you're only now noticing that you're losing. Over the next several hours, we're going to explore everything you don't know about Resident Evil Requiem, from the mysterious deaths of Raccoon City survivors across America to the underground laboratory that existed beneath the ruins all along, from a blind girl experimented on in the name of unlocking a cure to the revelation that Spencer's final project wasn't a weapon at all, but an act of atonement that came too late to save anyone. By the end, you'll understand why this game represents something fundamentally different in Resident Evil's timeline. It's a story about institutional memory, outlasting institutions, about contamination that runs deeper than biology, and about the horrifying possibility that the cure existed the entire time, locked away by the same people who created the disease. This video analyzes Resident Evil Requiem through thematic interpretation and psychological examination of how trauma persists across decades, how institutional evil perpetuates itself through legacy, and what it means when the only way to cure the past is by confronting it in the place where it all began. If something in this analysis resonates with you, drop a comment letting me know what connected, whether it was a specific revelation about the story, a character detail you hadn't considered, or just a moment that reframed how you see the Resident Evil timeline. And if you have ideas for future deep dives, throw those out too. Some of the best video concepts come directly from you. So get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's start. Chapter 1. When Survivors Never Stop Dying. Grace Ashcroft wasn't supposed to be investigating this case. October 26, 2026. 5 bodies have been discovered across the United States over the preceding weeks, each one showing identical symptoms: black bruising spreading across the skin like ink seeping through paper, severe organ degradation, tissue necrosis that appears to begin internally before manifesting externally, and every single victim was a Raccoon City survivor. The FBI designated the cases as connected incidents requiring investigation, but nobody wanted to call them what they obviously were. Another outbreak, another resurgence, another reminder that Raccoon City's contamination never actually ended. It just went underground, hiding in survivor cells while waiting for the right conditions to resurface. Grace works as a technical analyst for the FBI. She's young, introverted, trained in data analysis rather than field work. She spends her days processing information behind a desk, translating raw intelligence into actionable reports for agents who actually conduct investigations. She's not a field operative. She's not trained for confrontation. She's exactly the kind of person who should never be sent to an active crime scene. But the 5th body was discovered at the Wrenwood Hotel, and 8 years ago, Grace's mother, Alyssa Ashcroft, died in that exact location. Nathan Dempsey, Grace's supervisor, presents the assignment as an opportunity, a chance to face the trauma, to get closure on her mother's death, to prove to herself that she can handle returning to the place where she watched someone murder the only family she had. Grace recognizes this for what it actually is. The FBI using her personal connection to justify sending an analyst into a situation that requires an experienced agent. They want someone who can process the scene technically while also having the emotional investment to push through resistance when the investigation gets difficult. Grace accepts anyway, because 8 years of not knowing why her mother died has been its own kind of contamination, spreading through her life, making every career decision and personal choice circle back to that single night in Wrenwood when a hooded man slit the hotel manager's throat and then murdered Alyssa while Grace watched from across the lobby. The Wrenwood Hotel sits abandoned on the outskirts of the city. It's been closed since Alyssa's death, condemned as structurally unsafe, though everyone locally knows the real reason nobody goes near the building. Places where violence happens carry that history in ways that transcend rational explanation. The hotel feels wrong the moment Grace approaches it, not supernaturally, but in the way spaces feel when they've been sites of trauma that was never properly processed or resolved. Grace enters alone. The FBI's standard procedure would involve securing the perimeter, establishing a safe entry point, having backup positioned for immediate response if the situation deteriorates. But Grace is an analyst, not a field agent, so she walks through the front doors by herself, carrying nothing but a flashlight and the clearance to access an active crime scene. The body is in room 204, the same room Grace and her mother stayed in 8 years ago. This isn't coincidence. Whoever killed this person chose this specific location deliberately, either to send a message or because room 204 holds significance that Grace doesn't yet understand. The victim shows the same symptoms as the previous 4. Black bruising covering exposed skin, signs of rapid tissue degeneration, the kind of cellular breakdown that shouldn't be possible unless something viral was actively consuming the body from inside. Grace documents everything methodically, taking photographs, collecting trace evidence, doing the technical work she was trained for while trying to ignore the fact that she's standing in the room where her childhood effectively ended. That's when she finds the data disk, hidden behind the same painting Alyssa hid something behind the night she died, placed deliberately where only someone who knew that specific detail would think to look. The disk is labeled in Alyssa's handwriting. Just a date, October 19th, 2018, the night Alyssa was murdered. Grace doesn't have time to process what this means because that's when Victor Gideon appears. He doesn't burst through the door or attack from hiding. He simply walks into the room like he has every right to be there. A tall man in a snakeskin jacket with goggles that make his eyes impossible to read. He calls Grace by name, Miss Ashcroft, spoken with the kind of familiarity that suggests he's been thinking about this moment for a very long time. Grace runs. This is the correct tactical response when confronted by someone who knows your name in a condemned hotel where you're investigating serial murders. She makes it to the stairwell before Victor catches her, moving with speed that shouldn't be possible for someone his size. He uses a chokehold to render her unconscious, the kind of restraint technique that requires training and practice to execute without causing permanent damage. The last thing Grace sees before losing consciousness is Victor carefully securing the data disk she'd found, slipping it into his jacket with the care someone takes handling something precious. When Grace wakes up, she's strapped to a gurney in a medical facility she doesn't recognize. The Rhodes Hill Chronic Care Center sits on the outskirts of Wrenwood, a medical institution that's been operating for decades, serving patients with chronic conditions requiring long-term care. On paper, it's a legitimate healthcare facility. In practice, it's been a front for bioweapons research since Victor Gideon purchased the property following Umbrella Corporation's bankruptcy in 2004. Grace regains consciousness slowly, her mind struggling through the fog of whatever sedative Victor administered. She's in what appears to be a hospital ward, strapped to medical equipment, and 4-line running into her arm. The room is clinical but neglected, medical supplies scattered across counters, the kind of disorder that suggests staff abandonment rather than active operation. She can hear something moving in the hallway outside, footsteps that don't follow normal walking patterns. shuffling, irregular, accompanied by wet breathing sounds that shouldn't come from human lungs. Grace forces herself to focus through the panic. The restraints holding her to the gurney aren't locked, just fastened. Whoever strapped her down wasn't concerned about secure containment. They were just keeping her immobilized long enough for whatever procedure Victor had planned. She works her wrists free, careful to stay quiet, listening to the thing outside her door. The 4-line is still inserted in her arm. Grace examines it and realizes with growing horror that it's not administering fluids. It's collecting them. The medical bag attached to her 4 is slowly filling with her blood. Not rapidly, not in quantities that would cause immediate danger, but consistently, methodically, like Victor needs samples for testing. Testing for what? Grace pulls the 4 out, applies pressure to stop the bleeding, and slides off the gurney as quietly as possible. The room has a single door leading to the hallway where the shuffling sounds continue. No windows, no alternate exit. She's going to have to go out there with whatever is making those sounds. But before she opens the door, she notices something that makes the situation significantly worse. On the counter next to discarded medical supplies, there's a patient file. The name on the tab is familiar. Emily, Subject 171. Grace opens the file and reads the first page. Emily is a child. Exact age unclear but estimated to be young, possibly 8 to 10 years old. She's been a patient at Rhodes Hill for her entire documented existence. The notes describe her as blind, the blindness resulting from experimental procedures that induced severe cataracts. She's kept in isolation in the East Wing, separated from other patients, with restricted access even for staff. The notes reference another subject, Marie, Subject 170. Emily's cellmate until Marie was removed, following what the file describes as a failed procedure that resulted in severe mutations requiring immediate quarantine. Grace is still processing this when she hears a voice from behind the glass partition separating her room from an adjacent cell. Hello? Is someone there? The voice belongs to a child, young, frightened, speaking with the careful deliberation of someone who can't see their surroundings and needs to navigate the world through sound alone. Grace moves to the glass. On the other side, sitting on a hospital bed, is a small girl with pale skin and white hair. Her eyes are clouded with cataracts so severe that they appear almost white. She's holding a book, her fingers moving across the pages in patterns Grace recognizes as Braille. This is Emily. Grace tries to respond, but the words stick. What do you say to a child who's been locked in a medical facility her entire life, kept in isolation, deliberately blinded through experimental procedures performed by people who should have been protecting her? The answer is that you lie. You tell her everything is going to be okay. You promise her that you'll help her, that you'll get her out of here, that she won't be alone anymore. You make commitments you have no ability to guarantee because the alternative is telling a blind child that she's trapped in a nightmare and you might not be able to save her. Grace promises all of it. Then she looks for a way to open Emily's cell. The lock requires 3rd-level access clearance. Grace doesn't have credentials that would grant that access. She's going to need to explore the facility, find someone with the right authorization, and get back to Emily before whatever happened to this place gets worse. That's when the lights go out. Not gradually, not with warning. The entire facility plunges into darkness simultaneously, the kind of coordinated power failure that suggests someone triggered it deliberately. Emergency lighting doesn't activate. Backup generators don't engage. The Rhodes Hill Chronic Care Center is suddenly completely dark, and in that darkness, Grace hears something that makes her blood crystallize. A loudspeaker crackles to life. A calm voice announces Code 6. All staff are directed to implement emergency containment procedures immediately. Grace doesn't know what Code 6 means, but she knows what happens next because she can hear it spreading through the facility like fire consuming dry wood. Screaming. Dozens of voices, maybe hundreds, all experiencing something that transforms confused alarm into genuine terror in the span of seconds. The screams don't last long. They cut off abruptly, replaced by sounds that are somehow worse. Wet tearing noises, bodies hitting walls, and then the shuffling footsteps she heard earlier, multiplying, spreading through every corridor as whatever was wrong with the people making those sounds becomes the new dominant condition of everyone in this building. Victor Gideon has triggered an outbreak, not gradually, not through accidental exposure or containment failure. He's deliberately infected every staff member and patient in the Rhodes Hill Chronic Care Center, transforming the facility from medical institution to contamination zone in the time it takes to announce a single code over the intercom. Grace is trapped in a locked medical room, separated from a blind child she just promised to save, surrounded by people who are rapidly becoming something that isn't people anymore. And somewhere in this building, Victor is watching, waiting to see what happens when you infect an FBI analyst with a strain of the T-virus that's been mutating in Raccoon City survivors for 28 years, and then force her to survive long enough to prove she's the person he's been searching for her entire life. But Grace isn't alone in Rhodes Hill, because at the exact moment Victor triggered Code 6, someone else was entering the facility's front entrance. Leon S. Kennedy had been tracking the Raccoon City Syndrome deaths for weeks before Grace's investigation even began. He wasn't working officially. The Division of Security Operations didn't assign him to investigate why survivors were dying across America. Leon took that mission himself because he recognized what nobody else wanted to acknowledge. He's one of those survivors, and the black bruising spreading up his left arm, the tissue degradation he can feel beginning in his chest, the way his body has started fighting itself at a cellular level, despite 3 decades of successful antibody suppression, all confirm what he already knew. Raccoon City Syndrome isn't some new infection. It's the original T-virus finally overwhelming the natural immunity that's been holding it back since 1998. Leon doesn't have months. He might not have weeks, which means he doesn't have time for official channels or proper procedure, or waiting for the FBI to acknowledge that this situation requires immediate intervention. He witnessed Victor Gideon abducting Grace from the Wrenwood Hotel. He followed Victor's vehicle to Rhodes Hill. He walked through the front entrance, expecting to find a medical facility, and instead found himself in the opening moments of an outbreak that's about to transform an entire building full of people into infected. Leon has his sidearm, a custom DSO revolver he's nicknamed Requiem. It holds 6 rounds of ammunition, designed to punch through enhanced tissue, the kind of stopping power necessary when your targets can absorb damage that would kill normal humans. 6 rounds for a building full of infected is mathematically insufficient, but Leon has spent 30 years fighting bioterrorism, and the first lesson you learn in that line of work is that ammunition conservation matters less than shot placement. He needs to find Grace, get her out of the building, and discover why Victor Gideon has been hunting her specifically. Because this isn't random, this isn't opportunistic. Victor has been planning this for years, possibly decades, and whatever he wants from Grace is connected to the deaths across America, to Alyssa's murder 8 years ago, and to something buried in Raccoon City's ruins that nobody has managed to access despite 28 years of trying. But before Leon can reach Grace, he needs to survive the first wave of infected, now flooding Rhodes Hill's corridors. The transformation isn't instant. Victor's strain doesn't turn people into zombies in seconds. Instead, it spreads rapidly through respiratory systems, causing initial symptoms that resemble panic attacks or cardiac events. Staff members collapse, struggling to breathe, clawing at their throats as their bodies begin fighting biological warfare at a cellular level. Then the mutation accelerates. Skin begins mottling, eyes cloud over. Higher cognitive functions shut down as the virus rewrites neural pathways, redirecting all energy toward basic aggressive responses. Within minutes, the infected are upright again, mobile, hunting for living flesh to consume because the T-virus has rewritten their fundamental programming to recognize uninfected humans as food sources rather than fellow people. Leon moves through the facility methodically. He's done this before. Raccoon City Police Department, underground umbrella facilities, outbreak scenarios across 3 decades of counterterrorism work. The environment changes, but the fundamentals remain constant. Conserve ammunition. Use environmental advantages. Never let them surround you. And never assume that the thing that looks dead is actually finished. He encounters the first infected in the main hallway, a nurse still wearing her medical scrubs, stumbling toward him with movements that suggest her motor control is degrading faster than her aggressive instincts. Leon doesn't hesitate. Center mass shot drops her immediately, the round designed for maximum tissue disruption doing exactly what it was engineered to accomplish. 5 rounds left. Leon keeps moving. He needs to find the facility's floor plan, identify where they'd keep high-value detainees, locate Grace before Victor completes whatever procedure requires an FBI analyst's blood. But the building's layout isn't standard medical facility architecture. Rhodes Hill was built with areas that don't appear on any official records. Spaces designed for containment and experimentation rather than patient care. That's when Leon hears someone calling for help. Not Grace. A different woman's voice. Staff member by the sound of it, trapped somewhere in the East Wing. Leon knows this is probably a trap. Victor wouldn't just leave Grace accessible in an active outbreak zone. He'd use bait, create situations that force Leon to make tactical decisions that waste time and resources. But ignoring a call for help isn't something Leon does. 30 years haven't changed that fundamental aspect of who he is, even when strategic thinking suggests that individual lives matter less than mission objectives. He follows the voice to the East Wing, finding a nurse backed into a corner office by 3 infected. She's alive because she barricaded the door, but the infected are methodically breaking through the glass, and she's got maybe minutes before they get inside. Leon doesn't have ammunition to spare for this, but he has his hatchet. The blade won't kill infected permanently, but it will create enough damage to slow them down, buy time, allow him to reposition. He breaches the door, draws the infected's attention, and leads them away from the nurse. She escapes in the opposite direction. Leon uses the hatchet to disable the first infected, severs its motor functions at the knee, leaves it crawling, but no longer mobile enough to pursue. The second infected he drops with a precision shot when it gets too close for melee engagement. 4 rounds left. The third infected is the nurse from the hallway. Somehow she got back up. Somehow the round that should have kept her down didn't account for Victor's strain having enhanced regenerative properties. She tackles Leon from behind, trying to bite through his jacket, clawing at exposed skin. Leon uses the hatchet to create separation, then finishes her with a headshot that leaves no possibility of getting back up again. 3 rounds left. This is unsustainable. Leon needs to find Grace and extract before he runs completely dry on ammunition. But that's when he hears something that changes the tactical picture entirely. A gunshot from somewhere deeper in the East Wing. Not a rifle or standard handgun, something heavier, more specialized. Someone else is armed in this building, and they're using that weapon against the infected. Leon moves toward the sound because armed survivors are either potential allies or additional threats, and either way he needs to know who else is operational in Rhodes Hill. What he finds instead makes the situation significantly more complex. It's Grace. She's freed herself from restraints, acquired a handgun from somewhere in the facility, and she's currently defending herself against multiple infected while trying to operate a mechanical gate that appears to be the only barrier between her current position and something even more dangerous on the other side. Leon calls out to her. Grace spins, aims the weapon directly at him, with the kind of trained response that suggests the FBI taught her more than just data analysis. She doesn't fire, which means she's got enough tactical awareness to confirm targets before pulling triggers even in high-stress situations. Leon identifies himself. DSO Agent Kennedy. He's here to extract her. They need to move immediately. Grace doesn't lower the weapon. She asks the question Leon's been expecting since this started. Why am I here? Why did Victor Gideon target me specifically? What does he want? Leon doesn't have those answers yet, but he knows someone who does. Victor appears at that exact moment, emerging from shadows like he's been waiting for this confrontation. He's not infected. He's not running from the outbreak he triggered. He's calmly observing Grace and Leon like they're test subjects, performing exactly as his research predicted. He speaks directly to Grace, tells her she's the key to unlocking Elpis, that her master made her who she is, that she doesn't understand yet what she represents, but she will once they reach the Ark. Leon moves to intercept Victor, but Victor disarms him with movements that demonstrate combat training far beyond what a researcher should possess. He gets Leon in a chokehold identical to what he used on Grace, and while he's applying pressure, he notices something that makes him smile: the black bruising on Leon's arm, the Umbrella's curse, as Victor calls it, the Raccoon City syndrome that's slowly killing every survivor who made it out 28 years ago. Victor tells Leon he'll understand soon enough. Then he renders Leon unconscious and seals the facility, triggering security shutters that separate Grace and Leon completely. Before the shutters close, Leon does the only thing he can. He tosses his weapon to Grace, the Requiem, his custom revolver with 3 rounds remaining. He tells her to run, to get out of Rhodes Hill, to survive long enough for him to find her again. The shutters slam shut. Grace is alone in the East Wing, with Leon's weapon, and absolutely no idea what to do next. But she's not actually alone, because behind that mechanical gate she was trying to open, someone has been waiting. A small voice calls out, the same voice Grace heard earlier. Emily, still trapped behind glass, asking if the lady who promised to help her is still there. Grace looks at the weapon in her hands. 3 rounds, unknown number of infected between her current position and any viable exit, and a blind child depending on her to keep a promise she made without understanding the full scope of what she was agreeing to. This is where the real horror begins. Not the infection, not the monsters, the realization that Grace is going to have to become something she's never been, do things she's never done, make decisions that contradict every instinct about self-preservation and rational risk assessment. She's going to have to save Emily, which means she's going to have to survive Rhodes Hill, which means she's going to have to become exactly what Victor Gideon needs her to be. And somewhere in this building, Leon is waking up to discover that Victor Gideon isn't just a researcher obsessed with Umbrella's legacy, he's something far more dangerous. He's infected himself with a parasite that grants enhanced abilities while slowly consuming his humanity. And he's been planning this confrontation for nearly 3 decades, waiting for the exact moment when all the pieces would finally align. Raccoon City never ended, it just waited. And now, 28 years later, every survivor is discovering that their antibodies are failing, their survival was temporary, and the real horror was always going to be returning to the place where it all began to find the cure that was locked away the entire time. Chapter 2: The Laboratory That Pretended to Heal. Grace stands in the East Wing corridor holding a weapon she's fired exactly once in her life during FBI training qualifications. 3 rounds. The weapon feels heavier than it should, or maybe that's just the weight of knowing that 3 bullets is nowhere near enough for the situation she's in. Emily calls out again from behind the glass. The child's voice carries a tremor that wasn't there before. She can hear the infected moving through the facility. She doesn't know what they are, but she understands instinctively that something terrible has happened to the people who used to take care of her. Grace needs to make a decision. She can try to escape Rhodes Hill immediately. Use the 3 rounds to fight through whatever infected stand between her current position and an exit. Leave Emily behind because attempting a rescue with insufficient ammunition is tactically insane. Or she can keep a promise she made to a blind child. The choice isn't actually a choice. Grace knows this even as she's considering the rational arguments for leaving. She told Emily she would help her. That commitment doesn't become void just because the circumstances got significantly worse. Promises made to children who've spent their entire lives being failed by adults carry a particular weight that transcends tactical considerations. Grace moves toward Emily's cell, checking every corner, every shadow, listening for the shuffling footsteps that signal infected presence. The East Wing layout doesn't make sense for a standard medical facility. The corridors are too wide, the ceiling too high, the architecture designed for something other than patient comfort. This looks like containment, like the kind of spaces you build when you need to isolate test subjects from general populations. The glass partition separating Emily from the corridor is reinforced, the kind of transparent barrier designed to be observed through but not broken. A security panel next to the door requires 3rd-level access. Grace doesn't have credentials, but she notices something else. A staff member slumped against the wall nearby, one of the infected transformations that happened too fast for them to get far before collapsing. The staff member is wearing a security badge. Grace retrieves it, trying not to look at the person's face, trying not to think about the fact that this was someone who came to work this morning, expecting a normal shift at a medical facility. The badge grants third-level access. Grace swipes it, and the lock disengages with a pneumatic hiss that sounds impossibly loud in the corridor's unnatural quiet. Emily is sitting on her bed exactly where Grace saw her before. She hasn't moved, hasn't attempted to navigate her cell in the darkness that wouldn't make any difference to someone who's been blind for her entire conscious existence. She turns her head toward the sound of the door opening, her clouded eyes unable to focus, but her other senses tracking Grace's position. Grace introduces herself properly this time, says her name, explains that she's here to help Emily leave this place, but they're going to need to move carefully and stay quiet because there are dangerous people in the building who will hurt them if they're discovered. Emily asks if Grace means the sick people, the ones making the terrible sounds in the hallways. Grace confirms this, wondering how much Emily actually understands about what's happening. The child has spent her life in medical isolation. She's accustomed to institutional sounds, medical procedures, the ambient noise of a facility operating around her. But the sounds filling Rhodes Hill now aren't medical, they're biological horror, the wet organic noises of people transforming into something that used to be human and is rapidly becoming something else entirely. Emily stands. She's small for her age, whatever that age actually is. The medical file suggested 8 to 10 years old. But institutional neglect and experimental procedures can stunt development in ways that make age estimation unreliable. She's wearing a simple white medical gown that looks more like a prisoner's uniform than patient clothing. Grace asks if Emily can walk. The child nods, then extends her hand, asking Grace to guide her because she can't navigate spaces she's never been allowed to explore. Grace takes Emily's hand. The child's fingers are cold, her grip uncertain, the physical contact of someone who hasn't experienced much human touch outside of medical procedures. They move together into the corridor, Grace scanning for threats while Emily walks with the careful deliberation of someone who processes the world through sound and touch rather than sight. They make it approximately 20 feet before Grace hears something that makes her blood pressure spike. Footsteps. Not the shuffling gait of infected, but something else, heavier, more deliberate. The sound of something large moving through the darkness with predatory focus. Grace pulls Emily into a side room, presses them both against the wall, covers the child's mouth gently to keep her silent. The footsteps continue past their hiding spot, and Grace catches a glimpse of what's making them. It's tall, at least 8 feet, maybe more, its proportions wrong in ways that suggest severe skeletal deformation or accelerated growth that exceeded normal human dimensions. The skin appears mottled, decayed, hanging loosely in places where tissue degradation has progressed faster than structural integrity can maintain. Long arms with elongated fingers scrape against the walls as it moves, feeling its way through the darkness like it's hunting something specific. This isn't a standard infected. This is something Victor Gideon created deliberately, the result of experimental procedures designed to push the T-virus mutation in directions that serve research objectives rather than natural biological progression. The creature moves past their position. Grace waits until the footsteps fade before allowing herself to breathe normally again. Emily whispers a question that crystallizes exactly how terrifying this situation actually is. Was that Marie? Grace doesn't know who Marie is yet, but Emily's voice carries recognition, familiarity mixed with fear, like she knows exactly what that creature used to be and is horrified by what it's become. Emily explains while they move through the East Wing, her voice barely above a whisper. Marie was her cellmate. They lived in adjacent containment rooms, separated by glass but able to communicate. Marie was Emily's only friend, the only person who talked to her like she was a child, rather than a test subject. The hospital staff took Marie away several weeks ago. They said she was going to receive treatment for a condition they'd identified during routine examinations. Emily never saw her again. The staff wouldn't answer questions about where Marie went or when she'd be returning. They just stopped mentioning her entirely, like she'd never existed. But Emily heard sounds from the basement sometimes, wet tearing noises, things moving in spaces that were supposed to be empty. And one night, she heard Marie's voice calling out from somewhere beneath her cell. Except it didn't sound like Marie anymore. It sounded like someone screaming through a mouth that was no longer shaped for human speech. Grace is beginning to understand the scope of what Victor Gideon has been doing at Rhodes Hill. The facility wasn't just conducting research, it was actively experimenting on children, using them as test subjects for procedures designed to unlock something Victor believed was hidden in their biology. Emily and Marie were part of a larger program, multiple subjects undergoing different treatments, all in pursuit of an objective that required torturing children to achieve. They reach a security office where Grace hopes to find a facility map, some indication of the safest route to an exit. What she finds instead makes the situation considerably worse. The office contains medical files, dozens of them, all with identical formatting. Subject designations rather than names. Emily is Subject 171. Marie is Subject 170. But there are files for subjects numbered all the way down to Subject 148, suggesting at least 23 children have been part of this program. Grace opens one of the files at random. Subject 156, female, approximate age 9, administered 2.3 milliliters of infected blood containing T-virus variant and synthesized memory proteins. Result: subject experienced severe rejection response. Tissue degradation exceeded regenerative capacity. Subject expired after 17 hours. They killed this child, injected her with contaminated blood, watched her body try to fight the infection for 17 hours, documented the process of her dying in clinical language that treated her suffering as data points, rather than tragedy. Grace reads through more files. The pattern repeats with minor variations. Children injected with infected blood. Children exposed to memory transfer experiments. Children subjected to procedures designed to test whether genetic material could carry consciousness, whether the T-virus could be used to implant Spencer's memories into new vessels, whether any of these test subjects would survive long enough to become what Victor needed them to be. Most of them died. The files document death after death in the same emotionless medical terminology: treatments that failed, subjects that expired, experiments that yielded insufficient results. The few who survived the initial procedures developed severe mutations, enhanced physical capabilities combined with complete psychological breakdown. They became the variants now hunting through Rhodes Hill's corridors. Emily and Marie survived longer than most. Emily developed cataracts from one procedure but maintained mental stability. Marie showed increased physical strength and regenerative abilities but began exhibiting behavioral changes that suggested cognitive degradation. Then Marie was administered the final treatment. The file doesn't specify what exactly they injected her with, but the results are documented with disturbing thoroughness. Subject experienced rapid skeletal growth, tissue mutation consistent with extreme T-virus exposure, complete loss of higher cognitive functions, development of photosensitive reaction to UV exposure. Subject escaped containment and relocated to facility sublevels. Recommendation: euthanization pending director approval. They never euthanized Marie. They just sealed off the basement and left her down there to continue mutating in the darkness, documenting her progression through surveillance feeds, using her as long-term data for how the T-virus affects children over extended exposure periods. Grace looks at Emily, this small blind child who spent years in a cell next to someone who was being slowly transformed into a monster, and understands with perfect clarity why Victor Gideon needs to be stopped, regardless of what it costs. But before they can continue, the door to the security office slams open. It's not infected, it's not Marie, it's another staff member, a man in a doctor's coat, backing into the room while staring at something in the hallway. He doesn't notice Grace and Emily immediately, too focused on whatever he's running from. The man's name tag identifies him as Jeff Gray. He's bleeding from a head wound, his movements suggesting severe trauma, possibly concussion. He's carrying a flashlight in one hand and a scalpel in the other, makeshift weapons that won't do much against infected, but might buy him seconds if something catches him. Jeff sees Grace and Emily. His eyes go wide, focusing specifically on Emily with an expression that suggests recognition followed by immediate terror. He screams at them to get away from her, to stay away from Emily, his voice carrying the kind of panic that comes from knowing something Grace doesn't. Grace raises the weapon, puts herself between Jeff and Emily, demands to know what he's talking about. Jeff is barely coherent. He's saying something about Marie, about how she's looking for Emily, about how they need to seal this section immediately before she finds them. He keeps repeating that Emily isn't safe, that keeping her alive was a mistake, that they should have terminated her when they had the chance. That's when Grace understands. Jeff isn't trying to protect them from Marie. He's trying to protect himself from what he thinks Emily represents. He's one of the researchers who conducted these experiments, who treated children as test subjects, and now he's terrified that the consequences of what he's done are manifesting in the form of a creature that's hunting specifically for the only friend she remembers. Grace tells Jeff to leave. Just turn around and find his own way out of Rhodes Hill because she's not going to let him anywhere near Emily. Jeff doesn't leave. He's too frightened, too desperate, trying to explain that Grace doesn't understand the danger, that Emily is connected to the experiments in ways that make her a target for every variant in this facility. Grace is about to force the issue when something reaches through the doorway and grabs Jeff by the throat. It's Marie, the girl, as the files designated her. 8 feet of distorted biology, her skin hanging in patches where decay has progressed faster than regeneration, her fingers elongated into something approaching claws. She lifts Jeff off the ground with one hand, holds him at eye level, and for a moment Grace thinks she sees something almost human in the creature's face. Recognition, confusion, like Marie is trying to understand why this person smells familiar but can't quite connect the memory to meaning. Then Marie tears Jeff's throat out with her teeth. Grace fires. One round, center mass, the kind of shot that should drop any human target immediately. The round punches through Marie's chest, creates an exit wound the size of a fist, does absolutely nothing to slow her down. 2 rounds left. Marie drops Jeff's corpse and turns her attention to Grace and Emily. She moves toward them with disturbing speed but then stops. Her head tilts, nostrils flaring, processing scent information that her degraded vision can't provide. She's looking at Emily now, focusing on the blind child, with an intensity that suggests recognition. Emily speaks. One word. Marie's name, spoken with the kind of desperate hope that only children can maintain in situations where hope is objectively insane. Marie doesn't attack. Instead, she makes a sound that might have been an attempt at speech before her vocal cords mutated past the point of forming words. Then she reaches out, grabs Emily with surprising gentleness, and before Grace can react, disappears back into the hallway carrying the child. Grace runs after them, but Marie moves with impossible speed, navigating the darkness like the photosensitivity that makes her vulnerable to light, has simultaneously enhanced her ability to function in complete absence of illumination. She's heading down, into the facility's sublevels, taking Emily to wherever she's been living since escaping containment. Grace follows because abandoning Emily isn't an option. She descends through stairwells and service corridors that weren't part of Rhodes Hill's official floor plan, spaces designed for purposes that required being hidden from standard facility operations. The air gets colder as she goes deeper, the smell shifting from medical antiseptic to organic decay, the walls showing signs of damage that suggest something strong has been living down here long enough to reshape its environment. She reaches what appears to be a basement level that predates the current facility structure. Old concrete, rusted pipes, the architecture of something built decades ago and then forgotten when newer construction happened above it. This is where Marie has been surviving, and the evidence of her presence is everywhere. Scratch marks on walls where she's been sharpening her claws, bones scattered in corners from infected she's killed and consumed, and in the center of the space, a cell that looks like it was designed for long-term human containment. Emily is inside the cell, sitting among a collection of dolls. old porcelain dolls with their glass eyes and frozen expressions, dozens of them arranged carefully around the child, like Marie has been building some approximation of companionship in the only way her fractured mind can conceptualize. Marie is standing guard outside the cell, not threatening Emily, but not letting Grace approach either. She's making sounds that might be attempts at communication, gestures that suggest she's trying to explain something but lacks the cognitive capacity to form coherent thoughts anymore. Grace understands what's happening. Marie recognized Emily. Some fragment of memory survived the mutation, just enough for her to identify the one person who treated her like she mattered. So she took Emily somewhere she considered safe, surrounded her with the dolls they used to play with together, and is now trying to protect her from the infected roaming the facility above. In Marie's fractured understanding, this is rescue. This is friendship. This is the only way she knows to keep Emily safe. Grace needs to convince Marie to let Emily go. She can't fight the creature with 2 rounds of ammunition and no tactical advantage. She can't force her way past Marie to reach the cell. She needs to communicate somehow with what remains of a child's mind trapped inside a body that's become monstrous. But before Grace can attempt this, she hears something that changes everything. Leon's voice, calling for Grace from somewhere in the facility above. He's alive. Victor didn't kill him, which means Victor wants him alive for reasons that connect to whatever larger plan is unfolding here. Grace makes a decision. She tells Emily to stay calm, to trust that Grace will come back for her, to know that she's not being abandoned even though Grace has to leave temporarily. Then she runs back toward the upper levels, toward Leon's voice, hoping that together they'll have a better chance of extracting Emily from a situation that's rapidly becoming impossible. She finds Leon in what used to be the facility's administrative wing. He's conscious but restrained, tied to a chair in what appears to be Victor Gideon's personal office. And Victor is there, standing over Leon, with the kind of calm focus that suggests he's been waiting for this exact scenario. Victor sees Grace enter. He doesn't seem surprised. He tells her he's glad she's here, that they have things to discuss, that it's time she understood exactly what she represents. Leon tells Grace to run, to get out of Rhodes Hill while she can. But Grace doesn't run because Victor has something she needs to see. The data disk, the one Alyssa left behind in room 204 of the Wrenwood Hotel. Victor has it playing on a computer screen, and what Grace sees makes everything she thought she understood about her life disintegrate. It's a video interview. Alyssa Ashcroft sitting across from an elderly man in what appears to be a private residence. The old man is frail, clearly ill, speaking with the careful deliberation of someone conserving limited energy for important conversations. The man is Oswell E. Spencer, founder of Umbrella Corporation, the architect of bioweapons research that killed hundreds of thousands, and he's telling Alyssa about his greatest regret. Spencer talks about his vision for human evolution, about the experiments he conducted in pursuit of creating enhanced humans, about the children who died in facilities like the Raccoon City orphanage because he believed genetic modification could produce a superior race. Then he talks about his final project, Elpis, a word Grace has heard before but doesn't understand the significance of yet. Spencer explains that Elpis wasn't a weapon, it was an antidote. An antiviral designed to neutralize every progenitor-based virus he'd ever created, to render decades of bioweapons research inert, to undo the damage he'd caused in the name of human advancement. He completed Elpis in the mid-1990s, then he locked it away in a facility called ARC, buried deep beneath Raccoon City, protected by security measures that would destroy it if anyone tried to access it without the correct authorization. And then Spencer did something unexpected. He adopted a child, a normal infant, not part of any experimental program, not engineered or enhanced or modified, just a baby who needed a family. He named her Grace. The interview continues, Spencer talking about how he wanted to make amends, how he knew he couldn't undo the horror he'd created, but he could at least try to prevent it from continuing. He entrusted Grace to Alyssa Ashcroft's care, telling her that the child represented hope, that she was his attempt at redemption, that she would understand when the time came what she represented. Then Spencer says something that makes Grace's entire understanding of herself collapse. The password to Elpis is hope, and Grace is the only person who would understand why. Victor stops the video. He looks at Grace with the kind of satisfied expression that comes from confirming a hypothesis you've spent years developing. He tells her she's the key to unlocking Elpis, that Spencer made her who she is specifically so she could access the antiviral when survivors started dying, that her entire existence has been building toward this moment. Grace can't process this, can't reconcile the life she thought she lived with the revelation that Spencer adopted her, that Alyssa knew what she represented, that her mother died because she was getting too close to the truth about ARC, and the connections couldn't allow that information to reach anyone who might actually access Elpis. Victor moves toward her, speaking with the kind of reverence cult members direct toward prophesied figures. He tells Grace that he's devoted his life to Spencer's vision, that he's been searching for her since Spencer's death in 2006, that unlocking Elpis will fulfill his master's final work. Leon interrupts, tells Victor he's insane, that Spencer's vision got hundreds of thousands killed, that whatever Elpis represents doesn't justify the experiments conducted at Rhodes Hill or the murders of Raccoon City survivors. Victor barely acknowledges Leon. He draws a sidearm, a weapon he calls the Ghost Grudge, and points it at Leon's head. He tells Grace she has a choice. Come with him willingly to ARC, unlock Elpis, and Leon lives. Resist, and he kills Leon right now, then takes Grace by force anyway. Grace looks at Leon, sees the black bruising spreading up his arm, the visible signs of Raccoon City syndrome progressing toward the stage where antibodies fail completely and infection resurfaces. Leon is dying. Whether it takes days or weeks, the T-virus dormant in his system is waking up, and without intervention, he's going to experience the same fate as the 5 victims found across America. If Elpis is real, if it can cure progenitor-based infections, then Leon needs it as much as Victor wants it. Grace agrees to go with Victor, but she has one condition. Emily comes too. They're not leaving the child in Rhodes Hill to be hunted by infected or consumed by Marie's fractured attempts at protection. Victor considers this, then agrees, but only if Grace can retrieve Emily herself. He's not wasting resources extracting a failed test subject. If Grace wants to save the child, she needs to prove she's capable of the kind of decision-making that will be required to survive what comes next. Grace returns to the basement alone. Marie is still guarding Emily's cell, still making those sounds that approximate communication without achieving actual language. Grace doesn't have time for careful negotiation. She needs Emily now, which means she needs to get past Marie by any means necessary. She doesn't use the weapon. Instead, she talks to Marie, reminds her that Emily was her friend, that friends don't lock each other in cells, that the best way to protect Emily is to let her leave this place before the infected find her. Marie doesn't understand the words, but she responds to Grace's tone, to the lack of threat in her body language, to the fact that Grace keeps saying Emily's name in ways that suggest care rather than danger. Slowly, impossibly, Marie opens the cell. Emily walks out, reaches toward where she hears Marie's breathing, touches the creature's face with her small hands. She tells Marie thank you, tells her she won't forget her, tells her she hopes they can see each other again when everything is better. Marie makes a sound that might be crying if her tear ducts still function properly. Then she retreats into the darkness, leaving Grace and Emily to find their way back to the upper levels. They return to find Leon freed from restraints, standing next to Victor with the kind of tense cooperation that suggests a temporary truce rather than actual alliance. Victor has made his terms clear. Grace and Leon will accompany him to Orc. They'll work together to unlock Elpis, and in exchange, Victor will provide the cure that both Leon and Sherry Birkin need to survive Raccoon City syndrome. Sherry's name makes Leon's expression tighten. He didn't realize Victor knew about her condition, but of course Victor knows. He's been tracking every Raccoon City survivor, monitoring their health, waiting for the moment when syndrome would begin manifesting and give him leverage over the DSO agents who might otherwise interfere with his plans. A helicopter waits outside Rhodes Hill. The facility is burning behind them, either from outbreak containment measures or simply because Victor set fires to eliminate evidence. Emily clings to Grace's hand, asking questions about where they're going, whether the helicopter is safe, whether the sick people will follow them. Grace answers as honestly as she can. They're going to a place that might have medicine that can help people. The helicopter is safe, and the sick people won't follow because where they're going, there are worse things waiting than infected. They're returning to Raccoon City, to the ruins that have been quarantined for 28 years, to the underground facility that survived the missile strike, to the Ark where Spencer locked away Elpis and the secrets that died with him, but they're not going alone. Victor has backup. Another helicopter approaches, and from it emerges someone Leon recognizes immediately from classified briefings about bioterrorist organizations. His name is Zeno. He works for the Connections, the shadow organization that seized Umbrella's assets after the corporation's collapse. And he looks exactly like Albert Wesker. Not just similar, identical. Same facial structure, same build, same blonde hair, and preference for sunglasses even at night. The implication is obvious. Zeno is either another subject of Project W, a clone of Wesker created by the Connections, or something even more disturbing in terms of how extensively the eugenics programs continued after Umbrella fell. Zeno speaks to Victor with the kind of authority that makes it clear who actually controls this operation. Victor might have conducted the research, but the Connections funded it, provided resources, and maintained ARC's secrecy for nearly 3 decades. They're the ones who ordered Raccoon City's destruction, not to contain the outbreak, but to conceal Elpis's existence. They're the ones who've been manufacturing clones in pursuit of Spencer's memories, and they're the ones who will determine what happens to Elpis once it's unlocked. The helicopters lift off. Grace watches Rhodes Hill disappear behind them, the facility burning in the night, the infected still trapped inside. She thinks about Marie down in the basement, about the dolls arranged around an empty cell, about a creature that used to be a child trying to protect her only friend, in the only way her broken mind could conceptualize. Emily falls asleep against Grace's shoulder during the flight. Leon sits across from them, watching Victor and Zeno with the kind of tactical assessment that comes from decades of combat experience. He's calculating odds, looking for opportunities, trying to figure out how to turn this situation into something survivable. But Grace knows what Leon doesn't want to acknowledge. They're not in control here. Their assets being transported to a location where their usefulness will determine their survival. And once Elpis is unlocked, once the Connections have what they want, there's no strategic reason to keep Grace or Leon alive. The helicopter flies through the night, heading east toward Pennsylvania, toward the quarantine zone, toward the ruins where tens of thousands died and their contamination was supposedly ended with a single missile strike. Raccoon City appears below them. Not the crater Grace expected from news coverage and official reports. The missile was thermobaric rather than nuclear, designed to incinerate biological matter through extreme heat and pressure rather than radioactive destruction. The city's buildings still stand, skeletal and fire-damaged but structurally intact enough that you can see what used to be streets, recognize where downtown would have been, identify the rusted remains of vehicles abandoned during the outbreak. 28 years of quarantine means nature has started reclaiming the space, vegetation growing through concrete, trees emerging from collapsed buildings, the slow, patient process of ecosystem recovery happening in a place where humans can't interfere. But beneath that recovery, beneath the surface appearance of a dead city gradually returning to wilderness, something else has been operating continuously since the outbreak ended. The Ark, Spencer's final laboratory, a facility so deeply buried that even the thermobaric strike couldn't reach it, so thoroughly protected that the Connections needed nearly 3 decades to fully secure and understand what they'd seized. The helicopters land on the eastern outskirts of the ruins. Zeno explains the route they'll take through the quarantine zone to reach Eric's entrance. They'll need to move quickly because the ruins aren't empty. Some infected survived the missile strike, protected by being underground or inside structures that shielded them from the initial heat wave. Others are more recent arrivals, the result of bioweapon research groups using Raccoon City as a testing ground, where failed experiments can be abandoned without investigation. Grace picks up Emily, carrying the child because the terrain is too dangerous for someone who can't see obstacles. Leon stays close, weapon drawn, scanning for threats in the darkness. Victor and Zeno lead the way, moving with the confidence of people who've made this journey before. They pass through downtown Raccoon City. The locations Leon remembers from 28 years ago are still recognizable despite the damage. The police station where he started his first night as a cop, the gun shop where he found weapons, the streets where thousands of people died while trying to evacuate. But the real horror isn't the ruins, it's the realization that everything he survived, everything he fought through, every impossible decision he made that night, all of it was happening directly above a laboratory where Spencer had already locked away the cure. Elpis existed in September 1998, while Leon was fighting through infected and bioweapons, while civilians were being slaughtered, while the government was deciding whether to destroy an entire city. The antiviral that could have stopped everything was sitting in a vault less than a mile from where the outbreak began. Spencer could have released it, could have stopped the Raccoon City incident before it required a missile strike, but he didn't, because Elpis was his final secret, his last bargaining chip, his insurance policy against the corporations and organizations that would inevitably come looking for whatever he'd created. So he let Raccoon City burn, let thousands die, let survivors carry dormant infection for 3 decades, all to protect an antiviral that he'd locked behind security measures only one person could bypass. Grace, the child he adopted as his attempt at redemption, carrying the password in her name because Spencer believed that hope was the only thing that mattered after you'd created so much horror that forgiveness became impossible. They reached the entrance to Ark. It's hidden beneath what used to be the Raccoon City orphanage, the same institution where Spencer conducted his earliest cloning experiments, where children were used as test subjects for genetic modification programs that killed most of them. The orphanage is in ruins, but the basement levels remain intact. Zeno leads them down through collapsed infrastructure into spaces that show signs of recent maintenance. The Connections has been operating Ark for years, using it for bioweapons research and development, while trying to access Elpis without triggering the security measures that would destroy it. They descend deeper, past the orphanage basements into geological layers that predate the city's construction. Ark was built into natural cave systems, expanding them with modern technology to create a facility that could survive anything short of nuclear bombardment. The temperature drops as they go deeper. The air tastes like filtered atmosphere, recycled through systems that have been operating continuously for decades. And finally, they reach it, Ark's main entrance. A massive reinforced door, with Umbrella's logo still visible despite decades of neglect. Beyond that door lies Spencer's final laboratory, the place where Elpis was created, the vault where it's been waiting for someone who knows the password. Zeno opens the door. Inside, Ark is still operational. Emergency lighting illuminates corridors lined with research stations, containment chambers, archives of biological samples preserved in cryogenic storage. This is where Spencer directed his final research efforts, where he completed Elpis while the world above fell apart. And somewhere in this facility, in a vault called Pandora, Elpis waits. But before they can reach it, before Grace can unlock the cure that might save every Raccoon City survivor still alive, they need to understand what Spencer actually created, why he locked it away, what he knew about the Connections that made him decide protecting Elpis was worth letting Raccoon City die. The answers are waiting in Ark's archives, and they're going to change everything Grace thought she understood about survival, contamination, and whether redemption is possible after you've created weapons that killed hundreds of thousands. Chapter 3. The Children Nobody Was Supposed to Remember. ARK doesn't look like a laboratory that's been abandoned for 3 decades. The corridors are clean, the equipment functional, the lighting steady rather than flickering. Someone has been maintaining this facility continuously since Raccoon City's destruction. Not just the Connections conducting research, someone who understood Spencer's systems well enough to keep them operational, who knew which archives to preserve and which experiments to continue. Victor leads them through the main corridor. into what appears to be a central hub where multiple research wings branch off in different directions. Each wing is labeled with project designations: progenitor synthesis, tyrant development, memory transfer protocol, and at the far end, sealed behind additional security measures, Pandora. That's where Elpis is stored. But Zeno makes it clear they're not accessing Pandora yet. First, Grace needs to understand what she's unlocking. First, they need to confirm she actually has the knowledge required to bypass security measures that will destroy everything in ARC if the wrong password is entered even once. Zeno brings them to an archive room where decades of Spencer's research has been preserved. File cabinets containing documentation of every experiment conducted under Umbrella's banner. Computer terminals with access to video logs, research notes, correspondence between Spencer and the scientists who carried out his vision. This is institutional memory made physical, the complete record of how bioweapons research evolved from Miranda's cave discovery to global catastrophe. Grace needs to see something specific. Zeno pulls up video files dated 2005 through 2006, the last years of Spencer's life, recorded interviews he conducted with a journalist investigating Umbrella's legacy. The journalist is Alyssa Ashcroft, Grace's mother. The first video shows Alyssa sitting across from Spencer in what appears to be a private study. Spencer looks old, frail, the kind of physical deterioration that comes from terminal illness compounded by the weight of recognizing your life's work caused unimaginable suffering. He's agreed to these interviews on condition that they remain sealed until after his death. He wants to explain himself, but only to someone who will listen without judgment or interruption. Alyssa asks the questions Grace recognizes from her mother's investigative style. Direct, unflinching, forcing Spencer to confront specifics rather than hiding behind abstract justifications. How many children died in the orphanages? What Spencer knew about the Raccoon City outbreak before it happened? Whether he ever considered that his vision for human evolution was actually eugenics dressed in scientific terminology. Spencer answers honestly. The death count in the orphanages exceeded 200 children across multiple facilities. He knew about Raccoon City's outbreak in real time through Umbrella's internal communications, but chose not to intervene because doing so would have exposed ARC's existence. And yes, his ideology was rooted in eugenics, in the belief that humanity required forced evolution to survive its own destructive tendencies. But then Spencer says something that changes the trajectory of the interview. He tells Alyssa he's dying, cancer, aggressive and inoperable, the kind that gives you months rather than years. He's using the time he has left to make arrangements, to ensure certain projects reach completion, to attempt something approaching atonement even though he knows forgiveness isn't possible for the magnitude of harm he's caused. One of those arrangements involves a child, an infant he adopted in 1998, weeks before the Raccoon City outbreak. A normal baby, not genetically modified or experimentally enhanced. Just a child who needed a family and a home. Spencer tells Alyssa he's entrusting this child to her care. He's made legal arrangements, ensuring Alyssa becomes the guardian after his death. The child's name is Grace. Grace watches herself appear on screen. A toddler, maybe 2 years old, playing in the background while Alyssa and Spencer discuss her future. She has no memory of this. No recollection of Spencer or these interviews or the fact that the man who founded Umbrella Corporation chose her specifically to represent something he'd spent his entire life destroying. Hope. Spencer explains this to Alyssa with the kind of precision that suggests he's thought through every implication. He created Elpis in the mid-1990s, completed it before Raccoon City fell, locked it in ARC with security measures that would destroy it if accessed improperly. Then he adopted Grace, raised her for the first 2 years of her life, and made arrangements for Alyssa to continue that upbringing after his death. Grace represents Spencer's final attempt to create something that wasn't weaponized, that wasn't experimental, that existed simply because a child deserved to grow up without being treated as a means to an end. And the password to Elpis is hope, because Spencer wanted Grace to understand, when the time came, that she was never a test subject, or a genetic experiment, or a clone carrying his memories. She was just a child he hoped might have a better life than the thousands of children who died because of his research. The video ends. Grace stands in the archive room trying to process the fact that her entire understanding of her identity was built on incomplete information. She thought Alyssa was her biological mother. She thought her childhood moving from city to city was because of Alyssa's freelance journalism career. She never questioned why they had resources that didn't match a reporter's income, why certain doors opened for them that shouldn't have been accessible, why Alyssa seemed to be running from something that was never fully explained, because Alyssa was protecting her, keeping Grace hidden from the organizations that would recognize Spencer's adopted daughter as a potential key to accessing whatever he'd locked away, moving frequently to prevent the connections from tracking them down. And when the connections finally found them in Renwood, when they sent their assassin to capture Grace and eliminate Alyssa, Grace's mother died, buying time for her daughter to escape. Victor has been watching Grace process this. He speaks now with the kind of reverent tone cult members use when discussing prophecy. He tells Grace that Spencer made her special through adoption rather than genetic modification, that she represents the Master's final hope for redemption, that unlocking Elpis will fulfill Spencer's vision in ways that transcend the bioweapons research he's known for. Leon interrupts, tells Victor that Spencer let Raccoon City burn, that he chose protecting a secret over saving tens of thousands of lives, that whatever hope means in Spencer's terminology doesn't erase the fact that he was willing to sacrifice an entire city to keep Elpis hidden. Victor barely acknowledges this. He's focused on Grace, asking if she understands now why she's the only person who can unlock Pandora, why her existence has been building toward this moment, why the password only makes sense to someone who knows Spencer's final intentions. Grace looks at Emily, still clinging to her hand, this blind child who was tortured in the name of unlocking memories that never existed. Then she looks at Leon, the black bruising spreading up his arm now visible on his neck, his breathing slightly labored as Raccoon City syndrome progresses toward the stage where antibodies fail completely and dormant infection resurfaces. She tells Victor she'll unlock Pandora, but first she needs to know what happens to Emily. The child has been through enough. She deserves to be somewhere safe, not dragged deeper into a facility where bioweapons research continues. Zeno answers this question. He tells Grace that Emily is one of many failed attempts to recreate what they thought Grace represented. The Connections spent years manufacturing clones, injecting them with Spencer's genetic material and T-virus variants, trying to produce a subject who would inherit memories through blood and tissue. Emily survived longer than most, developed useful data about how children respond to memory transfer protocols, but ultimately she's a failed experiment with no further research value. Emily will be terminated after they access Elpis. Quick, clinical, the same fate that befell the 200 children who died in orphanages during Spencer's original experiments. Grace refuses, states clearly that Emily comes with them, that accessing Elpis is conditional on the child's safety, that if Zeno wants what's in Pandora, he's going to have to agree to Grace's terms. Zeno considers this, then agrees, but with a modification. Emily stays alive as long as Grace cooperates. The moment Grace becomes uncooperative, the moment she attempts to sabotage the operation or withhold the password, Emily dies. Immediately in front of Grace, as demonstration of what happens when test subjects outlive their usefulness, Leon tells Grace not to agree to this. They'll find another way to access Elpis, another route that doesn't require giving the Connections exactly what they want, but Grace knows there isn't another way. The security measures Spencer installed won't accept anything except the correct password, and attempting to bypass them will destroy Elpis and everything else in ARC. The only leverage she has is the fact that Zeno needs her alive and cooperative long enough to unlock Pandora. After that, all bets are off. They move deeper into ARC, past research wings where experiments in viral synthesis were conducted, past containment chambers that still hold preserved specimens from decades of bioweapon development, past archives documenting every atrocity committed in the name of human evolution. Leon falls behind. The exertion of navigating ARC's corridors is taking visible toll. His breathing has become labored, his movements less controlled, the Raccoon City syndrome progressing faster now that he's in the place where the original contamination occurred. The virus dormant in his system is responding to environmental triggers, recognizing on some cellular level that it's back at ground zero where T-virus research began. Grace notices. She tells Zeno they need to stop, that Leon needs medical attention before they continue. But Zeno makes it clear that Leon's condition is actually useful. The worse his symptoms get, the more leverage the connections have. Leon wants the cure as badly as they want access to it. His desperation ensures cooperation. They reach another archive section. This one contains research specifically related to the memory transfer experiments that produced Emily, Marie, and the other failed clones. Victor has been obsessed with these files for years, studying Spencer's notes, trying to understand how to successfully implant memories into new biological vessels. What he found instead was confirmation that the entire premise was flawed. Spencer's notes explicitly state that memory transfer through blood and tissue is theoretically possible but practically unfeasible. The success rate is so low, the subject's rejection response so severe, that achieving viable transfer would require hundreds of experimental subjects and decades of iterative refinement. Spencer abandoned the memory transfer project in the early 2000s, but he didn't destroy the research or shut down the facilities conducting experiments. He just stopped directing resources toward it, let it continue in the background while he focused on completing Elpis. The connections found these facilities after Raccoon City's destruction. They saw the incomplete research and assumed it represented Spencer's final work, that perfecting memory transfer was the key to accessing whatever he'd locked in Pandora. So they continued the experiments, manufacturing clones, injecting children with contaminated blood, documenting hundreds of failures while believing they were close to breakthrough. Emily and Marie are products of that misunderstanding. They suffered because the connections misinterpreted Spencer's notes, because Victor Gideon idolized his master so completely that he couldn't accept the possibility that Spencer had moved on from eugenics experiments to something approaching genuine atonement. Grace is beginning to understand the full scope of institutional evil perpetuating itself through misinterpretation. The connections didn't need to torture children. Spencer had already completed his final project, but organizations don't easily accept that their foundational assumptions might be wrong, especially when admitting error means acknowledging that people suffered for nothing. They finally reach Pandora. The vault is exactly what Grace expected. Massive reinforced doors, biometric scanners, security measures layered so extensively that attempting unauthorized access would trigger immediate destruction of everything inside. A terminal next to the entrance displays a simple prompt, password. One attempt. If Grace enters the wrong password, ARC's self-destruct sequence activates. The facility has explosive charges placed throughout its structure specifically for this contingency. Everything Spencer built, everything the connections have spent decades securing, will be destroyed in minutes if Grace makes a mistake. Zeno tells her to enter the password. Hope, simple and direct, exactly what Spencer told Alyssa during those recorded interviews, but Grace hesitates. Because entering that password means giving the connections access to an antiviral that could render decades of bioweapons research obsolete. It means potentially saving Leon and Sherry and every other Raccoon City survivor. But it also means trusting that Zeno will honor his agreement about Emily's safety, that the connections won't simply take Elpis and eliminate everyone who knows it exists. Leon tells her not to do it. His voice is weak, the syndrome progressing to the point where standing requires visible effort, but he's adamant that giving the connections what they want will create consequences worse than letting individual survivors die. Emily asks Grace what's happening. The child can hear the tension, can sense that something important is about to occur, needs reassurance that whatever decision Grace makes won't end with more people getting hurt. Grace looks at the password prompt. Then she makes a choice that will determine whether Spencer's final attempt at redemption actually meant anything. She enters Hope. The terminal processes the input. For several seconds, nothing happens, and Grace wonders if she misunderstood, if the password is more complex than a single word, if Spencer's explanation to Alyssa was incomplete. Then the vault opens. Pandora's interior is smaller than expected. A single room containing a computer terminal and a refrigerated storage unit. No elaborate security once you're inside. No additional barriers. Spencer's design philosophy for this space was that if you managed to access Pandora, you deserved what was inside. The storage unit contains vials, dozens of them, each labeled with precise documentation. Elpis, the antiviral Spencer completed before Raccoon City fell, the cure that existed while thousands died. Zeno moves to the storage unit immediately. He opens it, examines the vials, confirms through field testing equipment that this is genuine rather than a decoy. His expression shifts from professional focus to something approaching triumph. He spent years searching for this. The Connections invested massive resources into accessing Pandora, and now they have an antiviral capable of neutralizing every progenitor-based virus ever created. But then Zeno reads the terminal's documentation. His expression changes. The triumph shifts to confusion, then to anger, because Elpis isn't what the Connections thought it was. The intelligence they'd gathered about the project, the leaked information that suggested Elpis was a bioweapon with mind control capabilities, all of it was deliberate misinformation Spencer planted to prevent organizations from understanding what he'd actually created. Elpis is a cure, not a weapon, an antiviral designed specifically to undo the damage Spencer caused during decades of bioweapons research. It neutralizes T-virus infections, reverses G-virus mutations, breaks down progenitor derivatives into inert biological compounds. Anyone infected with Umbrella's creations can be cured by a single injection. The implications are staggering. Every bioweapon program operating in the world, every organization that built their power on access to progenitor research, every black market dealing in viral samples and bioweapon specifications, all of it becomes obsolete if Elpis is released. The military balance that's been maintained through mutually assured bioweapon capability collapses. The strategic value of viral research drops to zero. Spencer created something that would destroy his own legacy, an antiviral so effective that it would render Umbrella's entire research program meaningless, and he locked it away not to protect it from the world, but to protect the world from organizations that would suppress it to maintain the status quo that makes bioweapons valuable. Zeno understands this now. He's reading Spencer's final notes, documentation explaining that Elpis was never meant for the Connections or any other organization that would use it strategically. It was meant for release, for global distribution, for actually curing the infections Spencer's research created. But Zeno didn't spend years accessing Pandora just to release a cure that would eliminate the Connections' entire strategic portfolio. He came here for a weapon, for something that would give his organization advantage over competitors, for validation that Spencer's final project served the same vision of controlled human evolution that drove all his previous work. Finding out that Spencer's last creation was actually an act of redemption breaks something fundamental in Zeno's worldview. He can't accept that the man who founded Umbrella, who pioneered bioweapons research, who created the framework for militarized viral development, would end his life trying to undo everything he'd built. Victor has a different reaction. He's reading the documentation with the kind of reverent focus that suggests he's finally understanding his master's true intentions. Spencer didn't abandon his vision. He refined it, realized that forcing human evolution through viral modification was creating more suffering than advancement. So he created Elpis as correction mechanism, a way to reset the damage while preserving the knowledge that viral modification was possible. In Victor's interpretation, this is genius. Spencer created both the problem and the solution, gave humanity the choice between continuing down the path of bioweapons development or accepting the cure and abandoning that research entirely. Elpis is Spencer's final test for his species. Leon asks the question nobody else is willing to vocalize. If Spencer completed Elpis before Raccoon City fell, why didn't he release it then? Why did he let the outbreak happen? Why did he allow tens of thousands to die when he had the cure locked in a vault, less than a mile from where the T-virus was spreading? Victor answers this. Spencer couldn't release Elpis during the outbreak because doing so would have revealed ARC's existence. The Connections were already moving to seize Umbrella's assets. Spencer knew that if Elpis became public while he was still alive, Organizations would hunt him down, force him to create additional antivirals, or modify Elpis into something weaponized, so he let Raccoon City burn, locked the cure away, made arrangements for Grace to eventually access Pandora when enough time had passed that Spencer's death would prevent anyone from forcing him to corrupt Elpis's design. People died so Spencer could protect a cure from being weaponized. Grace is trying to process this when she notices something wrong with Emily. The child has been standing quietly, holding Grace's hand, listening to conversations she doesn't fully understand, but now she's breathing in a way that sounds labored. Wet, rasping sounds that suggest fluid building up in her lungs. And when Grace touches her forehead, Emily's skin is burning. Emily is transforming. The T-virus variants she was exposed to during Rhodes Hill experiments have been dormant, held in check by whatever limited immunity her young body developed. But the stress of the journey to Ark, the exposure to environmental triggers in a facility where viral research occurred, something has activated the infection. Emily starts convulsing, her small body shaking with seizures as the virus overwhelms her immune system, begins rewriting her cellular structure, pushes her toward the same fate that consumed Marie. Grace is screaming for someone to help, but nobody moves. Victor and Zeno are too focused on Elpis. Leon can barely stand, his own syndrome progressing to the point where he's leaning against the wall for support. Emily collapses, her breathing stops. For several seconds, Grace thinks the child has died, that the transformation killed her before reaching the mutation stage. Then Emily starts breathing again, but the sounds coming from her aren't human anymore. Her body begins changing, skin modeling, bones elongating, the same accelerated mutation that transformed Marie now consuming Emily. Grace is holding her, trying to stop the transformation through sheer force of will, but biology doesn't care about emotional attachment. Emily mutates fully, a smaller version of what Marie became, but with the same distorted features, the same degraded consciousness, the same aggressive instincts that recognize living humans as threats or food sources. The creature that was Emily lunges at Grace. Leon reacts on instinct, raises his weapon despite the effort this requires, fires a shot that catches the creature in the shoulder. The round creates massive tissue damage, drops the creature immediately. Grace is screaming at Leon to stop, that it's Emily, that they can cure her with Elpis. But Leon knows what Grace doesn't want to accept. The transformation is too advanced. Elpis neutralizes viral infections, but it can't reverse mutations that have already occurred. Emily's human biology has been overwritten. The consciousness that made her a child rather than a monster is gone. Leon fires again. This shot is aimed with the precision that comes from 3 decades of making impossible decisions. The creature stops moving. Emily dies for real this time. Grace collapses next to the body. She's not crying. She's gone past the point where crying makes sense. She just sits there, holding what remains of a blind child who trusted her completely, who believed Grace's promise that everything would be okay, who died because Grace brought her to the one place where dormant infections would inevitably resurface. Victor speaks. His voice carries neither sympathy nor cruelty, just clinical observation. He tells Grace that Emily's death demonstrates why Elpis matters. If released globally, if actually distributed to survivors before their dormant infections progress to transformation, thousands of people could be saved. Emily's death wasn't meaningless. It was demonstration of what happens when intervention comes too late. Grace looks up at Victor. Then she stands, walks to where Leon dropped his weapon after firing, picks it up and points it directly at Victor's head. Leon tells her not to do it, not because Victor doesn't deserve it, but because killing him won't bring Emily back and will eliminate their only source of information about how to actually use Elpis. Grace lowers the weapon. Then she does something that surprises everyone. She takes a vial of Elpis from the storage unit and injects it directly into Leon's arm. Leon's reaction is immediate. The black bruising visible on his skin begins fading. His breathing eases. The cellular warfare happening in his body stops as the antiviral neutralizes the T-virus that's been dormant for 28 years. Within minutes, Leon looks healthier than he has in weeks. Raccoon City syndrome is cured, just like that, one injection eliminating 3 decades of contamination. Zeno moves to stop Grace from taking more vials, but she's faster. She secures several additional doses, tells Zeno that if he wants her continued cooperation, he's going to accept that she's keeping enough Elpis to cure Sherry and any other survivor who needs it. Zeno agrees, not because he respects Grace's position, but because he's made a calculation. The connections already have Pandora's access. They can manufacture additional Elpis using Spencer's documentation. Letting Grace take a few vials costs them nothing while maintaining the cooperation they need to extract from Ark safely. But Victor makes a different calculation. He's been watching this entire exchange, and he's realized something that nobody else has considered. Spencer's notes contain information about how to modify Elpis, how to alter it from antiviral into something more strategically valuable. The connections want to suppress Elpis to maintain bioweapons market value, but Victor sees different possibility. He can use Spencer's research to transform Elpis into the mind control virus the connections originally thought they'd find in Pandora. He's been planning this for years, studying Spencer's work, understanding the mechanisms that make Elpis effective, identifying the specific modifications that would convert cure into weapon. All he needed was access to Pandora's documentation. Now he has it. Victor triggers a device he's been carrying. Not a weapon, a communication system linked to Ark's infrastructure. He's been working with the connections, but only as means to an end. His true loyalty has always been to Spencer's original vision, the belief that humanity requires forced evolution, that creating a superior race justifies any method. Elpis, modified correctly, could achieve what Spencer originally intended, not by creating enhanced individuals through viral mutation, but by using an antiviral delivery system to reprogram human consciousness on a global scale, inject the population with modified Elpis, use its ability to penetrate cellular barriers to deliver genetic material that rewrites neurological functions. Create a species that thinks the way Spencer believed humanity should think. Victor has been infected with something that makes his plan feasible, the N-gamma parasite, a variant of the organism used to create Nemesis-type bioweapons. It's been granting him enhanced physical capabilities, increasing his strength and durability while slowly degrading his humanity. Now he uses that parasite deliberately, allowing it to mutate him into something capable of executing the final phase of his plan. Victor transforms, not gradually. His body erupts with parasitic growth, tentacles emerging from his torso, his height increasing as the parasite restructures his skeletal system. He becomes something between human and bioweapon, retaining intelligence while gaining capabilities that make him nearly impossible to kill through conventional means. He attacks Zeno first. The connections representative was never part of Victor's plan, just a resource to exploit. A tentacle punches through Zeno's chest, lifts him off the ground, displays him like a warning about what happens to people who don't share Victor's vision. But Zeno doesn't die immediately, because he's not entirely human either. His resemblance to Wesker isn't just cosmetic, he's been enhanced through viral modification, granted superhuman capabilities that allow him to survive injuries that would kill normal humans. Zeno rips himself free from the tentacle, injures himself severely in the process, but escapes Victor's immediate killing strike. He injects himself with the Elpis vial he'd secured, thinking it will enhance his abilities further, give him the power to fight Victor on equal terms. Instead, Elpis does exactly what Spencer designed it to do. It neutralizes the viral modifications that were granting Zeno superhuman capabilities, strips away the enhancements, reduces him to baseline human biology, leaves him standing in Ark without the abilities that made him valuable to the connections. Zeno realizes too late that Elpis isn't a bioweapon, it's a cure, and he just cured himself of the only thing that was keeping him alive against Victor's parasitic mutation. Victor kills Zeno efficiently. No dramatic monologue, no explanation of his plan, just quick termination of someone who no longer serves useful function. Then Victor turns his attention to Grace. He tells her she's coming with him, that she's going to help him modify Elpis into the weapon Spencer should have created, that her understanding of Spencer's intentions makes her uniquely valuable for interpreting the research documentation. Leon moves to intervene despite only recently recovering from Raccoon City syndrome. He's still weak, still recovering, but he puts himself between Victor and Grace because that's what 3 decades of fighting bioterrorism has trained him to do. Victor disarms Leon without apparent effort. The parasitic enhancements grant strength that human combat training can't overcome. He stabs Leon through the abdomen with a tentacle, the same technique he used on Zeno, but this time the strike is calibrated to injure rather than kill. Leon drops. Grace rushes to him, applies pressure to the wound, screams for Victor to stop. Victor tells her Leon lives as long as Grace cooperates. She's going to help him access Spencer's modification protocols. She's going to assist in transforming Elpis from cure into tool for forced evolution. And if she refuses, Leon dies slowly from injuries that are survivable if treated but fatal if ignored. Grace has seconds to make a decision: let Leon die while refusing to help Victor, or cooperate temporarily while looking for opportunity to sabotage the plan from inside. She chooses cooperation, tells Victor she'll help him access the modification protocols, but first Leon needs medical attention. If Victor wants her focused on research rather than watching someone bleed out, he's going to stabilize Leon's condition. Victor considers this. Then he does something unexpected. He uses the N-gamma parasite's regenerative properties to seal Leon's wound, not healing him completely, just preventing death from blood loss. Leon remains injured, weak, incapable of fighting, but alive. Victor triggers Ark's self-destruct sequence. Not the instantaneous version that would have activated if Grace entered the wrong password. A delayed detonation timed to allow evacuation while ensuring the connections can't access Pandora after he leaves. The facility begins its countdown. 15 minutes until explosive charges destroy everything Spencer built. Victor takes Grace and the unconscious Leon toward Ark's emergency exits. Grace looks back at Emily's body, at the blind child who died because Grace made promises she couldn't keep. She takes the vials of Elpis she'd secured, holds them like they're precious, like they represent the only meaning Emily's death can have. They emerge from Ark into Raccoon City's ruins. The facility is collapsing behind them. Decades of research and documentation destroyed in controlled demolition. Victor has what he needs: Spencer's modification protocols uploaded to portable storage, Pandora's computer terminal secured before the destruction sequence activated. A helicopter waits, not the connections transport that brought them here. Victor's private extraction, arranged before he ever revealed his true intentions. Grace is forced aboard with Leon. The helicopter lifts off just as Ark's destruction reaches the surface levels. The ground beneath former Raccoon City orphanage collapses, creating a crater where Spencer's final laboratory used to exist. But the destruction doesn't matter to Victor. He has what he came for: Spencer's research, Elpis samples, and Grace's cooperation secured through threats to Leon's survival. The helicopter flies west, away from Raccoon City's quarantine zone, toward a destination Victor hasn't disclosed yet. Grace sits next to Leon's unconscious form, checking his pulse, confirming that Victor's parasitic healing was sufficient to prevent death even if it didn't restore full health. She still has the Elpis vials. Victor hasn't taken them because he needs Grace cooperative, and letting her maintain the illusion of having leverage serves that objective. But Grace knows this leverage is temporary. Once Victor completes the Elpis modification, once he has a weaponized version ready for deployment, there's no strategic reason to keep her or Leon alive. She needs a plan, a way to sabotage Victor's research without triggering immediate retaliation. A method of destroying the modification protocols while making it appear like accident rather than deliberate interference. But first she needs to understand where Victor is taking them and what resources he has access to for conducting the kind of research that requires equipment Ark used to provide. The answer comes from Victor himself. He tells Grace they're going to his personal laboratory. The Rhodes Hill Chronic Care Center wasn't his only facility. He's been operating research sites across the country, each one conducting different aspects of his plan to fulfill Spencer's vision. The helicopter approaches a location that makes Grace's stomach drop. It's a hospital, a legitimate medical facility, still operational, still treating patients. still presenting itself as normal healthcare institution. But Victor owns it through shell companies, controls the research wings, uses patient populations for experimental procedures disguised as cutting-edge treatment. How many Rhodes Hills exist across America? How many facilities are conducting experiments on people who trusted that medical institutions would help them rather than harm them? Victor lands on the hospital's roof. Medical staff meet them, people who know exactly what Victor is, and choose to work for him anyway because the compensation or the research opportunities or the simple fact that institutional evil pays well makes participation worthwhile. Leon is taken to a secure medical room. Grace is brought to a laboratory where Spencer's research documentation is already being uploaded to systems designed for viral modification protocols. Victor tells Grace her role. She's going to review Spencer's notes, identify the specific mechanisms that make Elpis effective, and help Victor understand how to preserve those mechanisms while redirecting the antiviral's function toward neurological reprogramming. She's going to help create the weapon Spencer refused to make, and if she refuses, if she sabotages the research, if she attempts to destroy the protocols, Leon dies. Not quickly. Victor will use his parasitic capabilities to keep Leon alive in state of continuous suffering, ensuring Grace understands the cost of non-cooperation. Grace looks at the computer terminal, displaying Spencer's research. Then she begins working, because the only way to sabotage this plan is from inside the process itself. But she's not working alone, because while Victor was focused on capturing Grace, while the connections were being eliminated in ARC, while the situation was deteriorating into bioweapon horror, someone else was tracking the entire operation. Sherry Birkin had been monitoring Leon's communications throughout his investigation into Raccoon City syndrome deaths. When Leon went silent after entering Rhodes Hill, when his tracking beacon disappeared into ARC's shielded facility, Sherry activated protocols designed for exactly this scenario. She called in the BSAA, Chris Redfield's organization, the group dedicated to fighting bioterrorism globally, and she told them everything. About Elpis, about ARC, about Victor Gideon's plan to weaponize Spencer's final creation. The BSAA is mobilizing. They're converging on Victor's hospital, preparing to breach the facility, to extract Leon and Grace, to prevent modified Elpis from being completed, but they're hours away. Maybe less if Sherry can provide precise coordinates, but still time for Victor to complete significant portions of his research. Time for the modification protocols to progress past the point of easy sabotage. Grace doesn't know rescue is coming. She's working on Spencer's protocols, identifying the mechanisms Victor needs, deliberately introducing errors so subtle they won't be detected immediately, but will cause catastrophic failure when Victor attempts to deploy modified Elpis. She's fighting institutional evil the only way available to her, by corrupting it from within, by ensuring that even if Victor completes his weapon, even if he manages to produce modified Elpis, the result will be unstable, unpredictable, more likely to kill him than achieve the forced evolution he's pursuing. But this plan requires time. Requires Victor not noticing the sabotage until too late, requires Grace maintaining the appearance of cooperation while undermining every step of the research process. And time is exactly what she doesn't have, because Victor isn't stupid. He's reviewing her work, checking her calculations, verifying every modification she suggests against Spencer's original documentation. He catches the first deliberate error within an hour, and his response makes it clear that continued sabotage will have immediate consequences. He brings Grace to Leon's medical room, shows her what the Any-Gamma parasite can do when directed with intentional cruelty. He infects Leon with a controlled dose, just enough to cause pain without triggering full transformation, demonstrating exactly how much suffering he can inflict while keeping his hostage technically alive. Grace stops sabotaging the research. She works correctly, providing Victor with accurate interpretations of Spencer's protocols, helping him understand the modifications necessary to transform antiviral into neurological weapon. Because the alternative is watching Leon experience biological horror while she maintains a doomed resistance that won't actually stop Victor from completing his plan. Sometimes cooperation is the only tactic available when resistance means immediate escalation to worse outcomes. But Grace is learning something Victor hasn't considered. She's reading Spencer's notes more carefully than Victor realizes, and she's finding details that suggest Spencer anticipated exactly this scenario, that he knew someone would eventually attempt to weaponize Elpis, that he built countermeasures into the research documentation itself. The modification protocols Victor is so carefully following contain a fatal flaw, a design element that ensures weaponized Elpis becomes unstable when deployed at scale, Spencer's final safeguard against his own research being corrupted. Grace just needs to make sure Victor follows the protocols exactly as written. No improvisations, no attempts to improve on Spencer's work, just faithful reproduction of what Spencer documented, which means helping Victor complete the weapon that will destroy him when he attempts to use it. Grace returns to the research, working efficiently now, no longer sabotaging but also no longer trying to prevent the inevitable. She's accepted that modified Elpis will be completed, that Victor will attempt deployment, that the question is not whether the weapon gets made, but whether Spencer's safeguards function as intended. The BSAA is still hours away. Leon remains hostage to Victor's parasitic capabilities, and somewhere in this hospital, patients are receiving treatment from doctors who are simultaneously conducting bioweapons research. The horror isn't the monsters anymore. It's the institutions that create them. The systems that allow people like Victor Gideon to operate with impunity. The fact that bioweapons research continues not despite Raccoon City, but because organizations learned the wrong lessons from that catastrophe. And Grace, Spencer's adopted daughter, the child who was supposed to represent hope, is helping complete a weapon that epitomizes everything Spencer claimed to regret, because sometimes the only way to stop institutional evil is to let it consume itself. The research continues through the night, and miles away, BSAA teams are preparing to breach a hospital where the final battle over Spencer's legacy is about to determine whether Elpis becomes humanity's salvation or its next catastrophe. Chapter 4: When Atonement Comes Too Late. 3 hours into the research, Grace makes a discovery that changes everything she thought she understood about what happened in Ark. She's reviewing the medical data Victor collected when he shot Emily, the bullet trajectory, the tissue damage, the vital systems affected by the round Leon fired, and she realizes something that makes her stop breathing for several seconds. Leon missed. Not accidentally, deliberately. The shot that appeared to kill Emily was precisely calibrated to incapacitate without hitting vital organs. Leon has 3 decades of marksmanship experience. He doesn't miss at that range unless he intends to miss, which means Emily might still be alive. Grace confronts Victor immediately, demands to know what happened to Emily's body after they left Ark, whether anyone verified death or if they simply assumed a child shot at close range wouldn't survive. Victor seems surprised by the question. He tells Grace that Emily's body was left in Ark when the facility was destroyed. Nobody checked for vital signs because checking wasn't necessary. The transformation was too advanced. Even if Leon's shot wasn't immediately fatal, the mutation would have killed her within minutes. But Grace knows something Victor doesn't. Elpis doesn't just neutralize viral infections. It reverses mutations if administered before cellular restructuring becomes permanent. Emily's transformation was recent, maybe minutes old when Leon fired. If someone had injected her with Elpis immediately after the shooting, before Ark's destruction, the antiviral might have stopped the mutation and saved her life. Nobody did that. They left a child's body in a collapsing facility because everyone assumed she was beyond saving. Grace is trying to process this, trying to reconcile the fact that Emily died not because rescue was impossible, but because nobody prioritized attempting it. When Victor receives a communication that makes the situation significantly worse, the BSAA has located the hospital. They're establishing a perimeter, preparing to breach the facility, demanding Victor's surrender and the immediate release of all hostages. Victor's response is immediate and brutal. He triggers security protocols throughout the hospital, sealing blast doors, activating containment measures, releasing bioweapons he's been storing in sub-basement research wings. If the BSAA wants to breach his facility, they're going to fight through layers of infected and experimental creatures before reaching the laboratory where Grace is working. Grace can hear the sounds of combat beginning in lower levels: gunfire, explosions, the wet organic noises of bioweapons engaging human targets. The BSAA is equipped for this kind of operation, but Victor has had years to fortify this location. The breach won't be quick or clean. Victor tells Grace to continue working. The modified Elpis protocols are nearly complete. A few more hours of refinement, and he'll have a deployable weapon. The BSAA's arrival just adds urgency to a timeline that was already aggressive, but Grace has stopped pretending to cooperate. She's read enough of Spencer's notes to understand that the safeguards built into the modification protocols aren't just design flaws, they're deliberate kill switches. Spencer knew someone would eventually attempt to weaponize Elpis, so he ensured that any weapon created from his research would destroy the person attempting to deploy it. The modified Elpis Victor is developing will work exactly once. It will demonstrate its capability to reprogram neurological functions. Then it will destabilize catastrophically, consuming the host organism through cascading cellular breakdown that even the any gamma parasite won't be able to regenerate from. Spencer's final safeguard was ensuring that weaponizing his attempt at redemption would require the weaponizer to become the first casualty. Grace explains this to Victor, shows him the documentation proving Spencer's protocols contain fatal design elements, tells him that completing modified Elpis means creating something that will kill him the moment he attempts to use it. Victor reads the documentation, understands what Spencer did, and then he does something Grace doesn't expect. He laughs. Not the unhinged laughter of someone broken by realization, the satisfied laughter of someone confirming a hypothesis. Victor tells Grace he knew about Spencer's safeguards. He's known for years. He accepted that completing the Master's final work would require sacrifice. That's why he infected himself with the any gamma parasite, not for the enhanced physical capabilities, though those proved useful, for the regenerative properties that might allow him to survive weaponized Elpis's deployment long enough to witness its effects on a global scale. Victor isn't trying to survive this. He's trying to complete Spencer's vision before dying in the attempt. He's accepted martyrdom as necessary cost for achieving forced human evolution. Grace realizes she's been approaching this wrong. You can't dissuade someone from a suicidal plan by explaining how it will kill them. You need to attack the plan's foundational assumptions. She tells Victor that Spencer abandoned the vision Victor is trying to fulfill, that the interviews with Alyssa proved Spencer recognized forced evolution as eugenics that caused suffering without achieving meaningful advancement, that Elpis was Spencer's rejection of everything Victor believes his master stood for. Victor dismisses this, tells Grace she's misinterpreting Spencer's final years, the adoption of Grace, the creation of Elpis as antiviral, the expressions of regret in recorded interviews, all of it was Spencer's acknowledgement that the methods needed refinement, not abandonment. Creating Grace as vessel for hope didn't mean Spencer stopped believing in human evolution. It meant he'd found a more elegant approach. Grace is arguing with someone whose entire identity is built on misunderstanding a dead man's intentions. Victor has spent decades constructing an interpretation of Spencer that justifies his own actions. No amount of evidence will dislodge that interpretation because accepting he's wrong means accepting his life's work has been pursuing something his master explicitly rejected. The BSAA breaches the hospital's third floor. Grace can hear them advancing through corridors, eliminating bioweapons, moving steadily toward the research laboratory. They have maybe 20 minutes before armed operators reach this location. Victor accelerates his work. He doesn't need Grace's cooperation anymore. The modification protocols are complete enough that he can finish the final steps himself. He moves Grace to the medical room where Leon is being held, locks them both inside, tells them they'll witness the deployment before they die. Leon is conscious now, recovered enough from Victor's earlier attack to speak coherently despite the pain. He asks Grace what's happening, whether the BSAA is actually here, or if that's wishful thinking made audible. Grace confirms the BSAA is real. They're in the building, but Victor is about to deploy weaponized Elpis, and the safeguards Spencer built into the protocols might not activate before Victor infects significant portions of the hospital's population. Leon tells her there's still a way to stop this. The vials of original Elpis Grace secured from Pandora. If they can get those to BSAA operators, if the antiviral can be administered to anyone Victor infects with modified Elpis, Spencer's cure might neutralize the weapon before neurological reprogramming becomes permanent. Grace still has the vials. She's been keeping them secured, treating them like they're the only good thing to come from this entire catastrophe. But using them means potentially running out before everyone who needs treatment receives it. Leon makes the calculation explicit. Save some people now, or save nobody while trying to preserve enough Elpis for theoretical future use. The choice isn't actually a choice. Grace hears something outside the medical room door. Not BSAA operators. Something else. Wet breathing sounds. Footsteps that don't follow human walking patterns. The same sounds she heard in Rhodes Hill's corridors when infected were hunting for living flesh. Something Victor released is in the hallway. Something that can open doors that are locked from inside. The door unlocks, swings open slowly, and standing in the hallway is a creature that makes Grace's breath catch. It's tall, 8 feet at least, its proportions distorted by skeletal deformation and accelerated growth, skin hanging loosely where tissue degradation has progressed faster than structural integrity can maintain, long arms with elongated fingers that scrape the walls as it moves. For a moment Grace thinks it's Marie, the girl who took Emily to the basement, the failed clone who tried to protect her only friend in the only way her fractured mind understood. But it's not Marie. It's something else Victor created, another failed experiment. Another child subjected to procedures designed to push T-virus mutation in directions that serve research objectives. The creature moves into the room. Leon positions himself between it and Grace despite his injuries, despite having no weapon, despite knowing that physical confrontation with something this size will end badly for him. The creature stops. Its head tilts, processing scent information that its degraded vision can't provide. It's not attacking, it's confused, like it recognizes Grace but can't understand why recognition matters. Grace speaks to it, uses the same gentle tone she used with Emily, asks if it can understand her, if some fragment of human consciousness survived the mutation. The creature makes a sound that might have been an attempt at speech before its vocal cords mutated past the point of forming words. Then it turns and leaves the room, shambling back into the hallway like it was never trying to threaten them in the first place. Grace realizes what just happened. Victor's experiments didn't just create bioweapons. They created children whose mutations included some form of recognition programming. The creatures retain fragments of memory about people who showed them kindness, people who treated them like they mattered, rather than like they were test subjects. The door remains open. Grace and Leon have a clear path out of the medical room, but before they can move, they hear Victor's voice over the hospital's intercom system. He's announcing deployment. Modified Elpis is ready. He's beginning with hospital staff, the people who work for him, the ones who will demonstrate the weapon's effectiveness before Victor attempts larger-scale distribution. Grace runs toward the laboratory. Leon follows despite his injuries, despite the fact that running requires effort his recovering body isn't ready to provide. They need to stop Victor before deployment spreads beyond this facility. They reach the laboratory to find Victor standing over a medical cart containing injectors loaded with modified Elpis. Several hospital staff members are already lined up, waiting to receive what Victor has told them is an enhancement that will grant superior cognitive capabilities. They believe him. They're cooperating voluntarily. They think Victor is offering improvement rather than conducting lethal experimentation. Grace tries to warn them, tells them the injections will kill them, that modified Elpis contains fatal design flaws, that they need to evacuate immediately. The staff members look at Victor for confirmation. He tells them Grace is confused, traumatized from her experiences at Rhodes Hill, attempting to sabotage research she doesn't understand. He's calm, authoritative, using the institutional credibility that comes from being a respected director to override Grace's warnings. One staff member accepts an injection. Then another. Victor is administering modified Elpis with clinical precision, documenting subjects' responses, treating this deployment as research rather than mass murder. The first staff member who received injection begins exhibiting effects, not immediately catastrophic, actually the opposite. They report feeling enhanced mental clarity, improved focus, sensory information processing with greater efficiency than they've experienced before. Modified Elpis is working. The neurological reprogramming Spencer's safeguards were supposed to prevent is occurring without triggering immediate cellular breakdown. Victor sees Grace's expression change. He tells her that Spencer's safeguards failed because Victor improved on the original protocols. He didn't follow Spencer's documentation exactly. He refined it, corrected the deliberate flaws, produced something that achieves forced evolution without the fatal consequences Spencer designed into the system. Except that's not what happened. Grace is reading the subject's vital signs on the laboratory monitors. The neurological enhancement is real, but it's temporary. The cellular modifications required to achieve enhanced cognition are consuming biological resources faster than the subject's bodies can replace them. In approximately 6 hours, catastrophic organ failure will begin. In 12 hours, every subject Victor injected will be dead. Spencer's safeguards didn't fail. They're just slower than Victor anticipated. Slow enough to let him believe he succeeded before the people he enhanced start dying from success. Grace tries to explain this. Victor ignores her. He's already preparing the next round of injections, already planning how to expand deployment beyond the hospital. That's when the BSAA breaches the laboratory. The operators come through multiple entry points simultaneously, establishing fields of fire that cover every angle, eliminating any possibility of Victor escaping. They're led by someone Grace recognizes from news coverage of bioterrorism incidents, Chris Redfield, BSAA's founder, one of the original Raccoon City survivors. Someone who's spent 3 decades fighting to prevent exactly what Victor represents. Chris issues standard commands: drop the weapons, release the hostages, surrender peacefully, and nobody else needs to die tonight. Victor doesn't comply. Instead, he injects himself with a massive dose of modified Elpis, not the carefully calibrated amount he administered to staff members, a concentration designed to trigger immediate and extreme transformation. The Any-gamma parasite reacts to the injection. Victor's body erupts with parasitic growth, tentacles bursting from his torso, his height increasing as skeletal restructuring occurs with horrifying speed. He's transforming into something between nemesis and human, retaining intelligence while gaining physical capabilities that make him nearly impossible to kill through conventional means. The BSAA operators open fire immediately. Standard protocol when a bioweapon transformation begins in enclosed space. Their ammunition is designed for maximum tissue disruption, the kind of stopping power necessary when targets can absorb damage that would kill normal humans. Victor doesn't go down. The rounds create massive wounds, but the Any-gamma parasite's regenerative properties seal the damage faster than bullets can accumulate. He's becoming what he always believed Spencer wanted him to be: an evolved human, superior to baseline biology, capable of surviving conditions that would destroy ordinary people. Chris directs his team to fall back, establish better firing positions, bring anti-bioweapon ordnance to bear. But Victor is faster than his size suggests. He's moving through the laboratory with terrifying speed, using tentacles to attack operators while his regeneration keeps him functional despite continuous fire. Leon tells Grace to get the original Elpis to the BSAA medics. The staff members Victor infected need treatment before the safeguards kill them. Grace still has the vials secured. She can save these people if she moves now. Grace runs, not away from the combat, toward it, because the BSAA medics are positioned in the corridor outside the laboratory, treating wounded operators, establishing triage for the casualties this breach is producing. She reaches the medics, hands them the Elpis vials, explains that hospital staff have been infected with a modified strain and need this antiviral administered immediately to prevent lethal complications. The medics don't question. They take the vials, begin preparing injections. move toward the staff members who are already showing early signs of the cellular breakdown Grace predicted. Original Elpis neutralizes modified Elpis. The neurological enhancements disappear, but the subjects survive. They're confused, disoriented, asking what happened and why they feel like they've lost something they can't quite identify. But they're alive. Spencer's attempt at creating a cure is saving people from Spencer's attempt at creating a weapon, even when that weapon was constructed from the cure itself. Grace returns to the laboratory entrance. The combat inside has intensified. Victor has killed 2 BSAA operators, injured several more, and is now fully transformed into something that barely resembles the human he used to be. His body is mostly tentacles now, the parasitic growth having consumed so much of his original biology that only his head remains recognizably human. Chris is coordinating fire from multiple angles, trying to create enough accumulated damage that even Victor's regeneration can't keep pace. But Victor is adaptive. He's learning from each exchange, positioning himself to minimize exposure, using the laboratory equipment as cover while his tentacles lash out at anyone who gets too close. Leon enters the laboratory despite Chris's orders to stay back. He's not BSAA. He's not following their chain of command. He's DSO, and his jurisdiction includes eliminating bioterrorist threats, regardless of who's conducting the operation. Leon still has his weapon, the Requiem. Grace returned it after using Elpis to cure his Raccoon City syndrome. 6 rounds, the same custom ammunition designed to punch through enhanced tissue. He engages Victor directly, not from distance where the BSAA operators are maintaining suppressive fire. Close range, the kind of combat that requires accepting you might die in order to create the opening necessary to kill your target. Victor recognizes Leon, tells him this is fitting, that Leon represents the old model of humanity, the survivor who refused to accept enhancement, the man who chose to remain baseline human despite having opportunities to become something greater. Leon tells Victor he's had enough of people who think forcing evolution is an improvement over letting humans choose their own development. Then he fires, all 6 rounds in rapid succession, each shot placed with the precision that comes from 30 years of making impossible shots in situations where missing meant people died. The rounds punch through Victor's parasitic mass, create damage the regeneration struggles to seal. 1 round catches Victor's head, destroying enough neurological tissue that motor control begins failing. Victor collapses, but he's not dead. The Any-gamma parasite is keeping him alive, forcing regeneration even when biological logic suggests the damage is too severe for recovery. Chris moves in to finish this. He has specialized ammunition designed specifically for Nemesis-type bioweapons, incendiary rounds that create heat damage the parasite can't regenerate through. But before Chris can fire, Victor does something nobody expected. He injects himself with original Elpis, not modified, the cure Grace gave to BSAA medics. Victor must have secured additional vials from Pandora before Ark's destruction. He's kept them as insurance, as final option if the modified version proved unstable. Original Elpis floods Victor's system, neutralizes the Any-gamma parasite, strips away the mutations, reverses the transformations, reduces Victor from bioweapon back to human biology, which means Victor is now dying. Because the damage Leon and the BSAA inflicted doesn't disappear when the parasite gets neutralized, it just stops being regenerated. Victor has bullet wounds throughout his torso, catastrophic tissue loss from multiple angles of fire, injuries that would have killed him instantly if the parasite hadn't been maintaining cellular function. He collapses completely now, human again, dying from injuries that only look survivable when you're functionally immortal. Grace approaches him, not to gloat, not to claim victory, just to be present when he dies, so he doesn't die alone, despite being a monster who tortured children. Victor looks at her. His eyes are clearing, the parasitic influence fading, leaving someone who's confronting the fact that he spent decades pursuing a vision his master had explicitly abandoned. He tells Grace he understands now, that Spencer's final message wasn't about perfecting forced evolution. It was about accepting that some damage can't be fixed, some horror can't be redeemed. Some choices create consequences that persist regardless of how sincerely you regret them afterward. Modified Elpis would have killed everyone Victor infected. Original Elpis saved them. The difference between the two versions is the difference between trying to force humanity into something you believe it should be versus accepting humanity as it actually is and trying to minimize the harm your previous choices created. Victor dies. The parasitic growth dissolves, leaving a corpse that looks almost peaceful despite the violence that created it. Chris secures the laboratory. His team collects the remaining modified Elpis samples, documents Victor's research, begins the process of ensuring this weaponized version doesn't spread beyond this facility. Grace asks Chris about ARC, whether they sent teams to the ruins after the destruction sequence completed, whether anyone checked for survivors before the facility collapsed completely. Chris tells her ARC was a total loss. The self-destruct sequence eliminated everything structural. If anyone was left inside when the countdown started, they didn't survive the collapse. Grace thinks about Emily, about a blind child who might have survived Leon's shot, who might have been saved with original Elpis if anyone had prioritized attempting rescue instead of assuming death, about how institutional priorities determine who gets saved and who gets abandoned. But then Chris tells her something that changes everything. They found a survivor in ARC's ruins, pulled from the wreckage hours after the facility collapsed. A child, badly injured but alive, currently in BSAA medical custody receiving treatment. Grace demands to see the child. Chris hesitates, explaining that survivors from Victor's experiments are being quarantined until doctors can determine the extent of viral contamination and mutation. Letting Grace have contact before decontamination completes would risk infection. Grace tells Chris she has original Elpis, that if this child is who she thinks it is, the antiviral will reverse any mutations and cure any contamination. That medical quarantine isn't necessary when you have a cure that neutralizes all progenitor-based viruses. Chris considers this. Then he makes a decision that prioritizes humanity over protocol. He brings Grace to the medical wing, where BSAA doctors are treating the child they recovered. It's Emily, barely recognizable through the injuries and the partial mutations, but identifiably the same blind child Grace promised to save. Leon's shot hit her shoulder, creating massive tissue damage, but missing vitals just like Grace suspected. The mutation began, but didn't complete before she lost consciousness. Then ARC's collapse buried her under rubble that simultaneously protected her from the worst of the destruction and prevented her from escaping. She survived through combination of Victor's experimental enhancements, granting increased durability, and pure chance that falling debris created an air pocket rather than crushing her completely. BSAA operators found her when they were searching ARC's ruins for intelligence about the connection's operations. They extracted her, brought her to medical facilities, began treatment without knowing who she was or why she'd been in Spencer's laboratory. Grace administers Elpis herself, injects it directly into Emily's bloodstream, watches as the antiviral neutralizes the T-virus variants, reverses the partial mutations, begins healing damage that doctors thought would require months of recovery. Emily wakes up, confused, frightened, asking for Grace, in a small voice that breaks something fundamental in Grace's chest. Grace tells her she's safe, that the bad people are gone, that she's never going to be locked in a cell or experimented on again, that Grace is going to make sure she has a real home and a real family and a real life, instead of being treated as a test subject. Emily asks a question that shouldn't be possible given her medical history. She asks what Grace looks like, because Emily can see. The cataracts that made her blind are gone. Elpis didn't just cure the viral infection and reverse the mutations, it healed the damage Victor's experiments caused, regenerated tissue that was destroyed during procedures designed to test how children respond to extreme viral exposure. Emily has her sight for the first time in her conscious existence. Grace is crying, actually crying, not the numb emotional shutdown that's been carrying her through Rhodes Hill and ARC and Victor's hospital, just open weeping because a child who suffered unimaginable horror is alive and safe and can see the person who kept promising everything would be okay even when that promise seemed impossible to fulfill. Emily reaches up, touches Grace's face, traces the tears with small fingers that are learning how touch corresponds to visual information. She tells Grace she's pretty, that she looks exactly how Emily imagined someone safe would look. Chris gives them privacy. The BSAA will handle cleanup, evidence collection, ensuring Victor's research doesn't spread to other organizations. But Grace and Emily deserve time that isn't dominated by institutional priorities. Leon finds them several hours later. He's recovered enough to walk without assistance. The injuries Victor inflicted healing now that Elpis has removed the Raccoon City syndrome that was complicating his recovery. He tells Grace that Sherry received Elpis treatment as well. Her Raccoon City syndrome is cured. The G-virus enhancements she's carried since childhood are neutralized. She's baseline human for the first time since she was 12 years old. Thousands of Raccoon City survivors are being contacted. The BSAA is coordinating with public health agencies to identify everyone who might be carrying dormant T-virus and administer Elpis before Raccoon City syndrome progresses to lethal stages. Spencer's final project is being released exactly as he intended, not as weapon, as cure, the antiviral that renders decades of bioweapons research obsolete is becoming publicly available, distributed through legitimate medical channels rather than seized by organizations that would suppress it. The bioweapons market is collapsing. Organizations that built power on access to viral samples are losing their strategic advantage. The connections, weakened by Xeno's death and Ark's destruction, is being systematically dismantled by international law enforcement that suddenly has tools to neutralize bioweapon threats. Raccoon City's contamination is finally ending, not through quarantine or missile strikes, or pretending dormant infection doesn't exist, through actual treatment, through accepting that survivors deserve cure rather than being abandoned to die from infections they carried for 3 decades. Grace asks Leon what happens to Emily. The child has no legal guardian, no family, no identity beyond the designation Subject 171. She'll become a ward of whatever government agency handles bioweapon survivors, unless someone claims responsibility for her care. Leon tells Grace she knows what happens to Emily. Grace has been making that decision since the moment she promised to help a blind child in Rhodes Hill. Grace adopts Emily officially. The legal process is complicated by Emily's lack of documentation, by her status as experimental subject, by the fact that her entire existence has been institutional rather than familial. But Alyssa left Grace resources, inheritance from Spencer that Grace never understood the source of until she learned about her adoption. Money that was supposed to support her after Spencer's death. Grace uses that inheritance to build Emily's life, enrolls her in school, gets her therapy to process trauma, teaches her to read with her eyes instead of her fingers, gives her the childhood that was stolen when Victor decided she was more valuable as test subject than as person. Months pass, the immediate crisis resolves into long-term recovery. Grace returns to the FBI but transfers to a division that investigates bioweapons trafficking. Leon continues with DSO, his Raccoon City syndrome cured but his commitment to preventing bioterrorism unchanged. Sherry adjusts to life without the enhancements that defined her for decades, and Emily grows. Not physically, though that happens too, emotionally, psychologically, learning how to be a child rather than a subject, discovering that the world contains kindness as well as cruelty, that not all institutions betray the people they're supposed to protect, that survival can eventually become something more than just not dying. Grace teaches Emily about Alyssa, about the mother who died protecting her daughter, about the journalist who believed truth mattered even when truth made her a target, about the woman Spencer trusted to raise Grace because he knew she would prioritize Grace's humanity over any strategic value Spencer's adoption might carry. Emily asks if Spencer was good or bad. It's the kind of question children ask when they're trying to understand morality in a world that doesn't offer simple answers. Grace tells her the truth. Spencer created horror that killed hundreds of thousands. He also created the cure that saved thousands of survivors. He locked that cure away for decades while people suffered. He also ensured it would eventually reach the people who needed it. He was responsible for experiments that tortured children. He also adopted a child he treated with genuine care. People aren't good or bad. They're complicated. They make choices that create consequences. They carry responsibility for harm they cause, even when they later regret it. And sometimes the best they can do is try to minimize future damage, while accepting that past damage can't be undone. Emily thinks about this. Then she asks if Grace thinks she's complicated too. Grace tells her that everyone is. But being complicated doesn't mean you can't choose kindness. Doesn't mean you can't try to help people instead of hurting them. Doesn't mean you're not responsible for being better than the people who had power over you and used it to cause suffering. Emily accepts this answer, goes back to reading a book she's practicing with, her vision still adjusting to processing written language, her recovery ongoing but progressing. Grace watches her and thinks about Spencer's final message, the password that unlocked Elpis. Hope. Not hope that past horror could be erased. Not hope that atonement would undo harm already caused. Just hope that future generations might make different choices than the ones that created bioweapons research. That children like Emily might grow up without being treated as raw material for experiments that serve visions of perfected humanity nobody actually asked for. Raccoon City never ended. Its contamination persisted for 28 years, dormant in survivors' blood, waiting for the moment antibodies would fail and infection would resurface. But what also persisted was the cure, locked away, protected, surviving through institutional collapse and organizational seizure and deliberate attempts to weaponize it. Spencer's final project wasn't perfect redemption. It was incomplete atonement from someone who recognized he'd caused unforgivable harm and tried anyway to prevent that harm from continuing forever. The cure existed the entire time, right beneath the city where tens of thousands died, waiting for someone who understood that hope isn't about forgetting the past or pretending damage can be reversed. Hope is about accepting responsibility for harm you caused while still believing future choices can create different outcomes. Emily falls asleep reading. Grace carries her to bed, tucks her in, leaves a nightlight on because Emily still sometimes wakes up disoriented, expecting to be back in the cell at Rhodes Hill. Outside, the world continues. Bioweapons research hasn't ended. Organizations still pursue enhancement through viral modification, but Elpis exists now. The cure is available, and every experiment, every weaponized virus, every attempt to force evolution carries the knowledge that someone created an antiviral that neutralizes it. Spencer's legacy is complicated. The horror he created, the cure he completed, the child he adopted, the institutional evil that persisted long after his death, the hope he believed might matter even when hope seemed meaningless against the magnitude of suffering he'd caused. And Grace, carrying that legacy, raising a child who survived torture in the name of unlocking secrets that never existed, represents what comes after catastrophe. Not perfect healing, not complete justice, just the difficult work of preventing horror from perpetuating while acknowledging that past horror can't be undone. Emily will grow up carrying memories of Rhodes Hill that therapy will help but never eliminate. Grace will investigate bioweapons trafficking, using Spencer's inheritance to fight the institutions his research created. Leon will continue the work that's defined 3 decades of his life, knowing now that Raccoon City's contamination has finally been treated even if its trauma persists. Resident Evil Requiem asks whether redemption is possible after you've created weapons that killed hundreds of thousands, whether adopting a child and creating a cure compensates for torture and catastrophe, whether institutions can be reformed or whether they just perpetuate themselves in new forms with different names. The answer isn't comforting. The answer is that fighting matters even when fighting doesn't culminate in victory. That individual choices create consequences that ripple forward. That you carry responsibility for harm you cause, regardless of how sincerely you regret it afterward. And that sometimes, buried beneath ruins where horror happened, there's a cure waiting for someone brave enough to unlock it and wise enough to use it correctly. The nightmare that began in 1919 finally ends in 2026. Not with destruction, with treatment, with accepting that survivors deserve healing rather than being abandoned to die from contamination they carried for decades. Raccoon City is over, for now.